Welcome, everybody, to the Special Committee on Voter Confidence meeting. We are convening here in Berlin, and it's wonderful to be back in the North Country to see some friends and to meet new friends, but more importantly, to have a discussion about how we can improve voter confidence in our electoral system. My name is Richard Swett. I'm a former representative in Congress of the North Country. I am an architect from Bow now, doing my civic duty, and I think the best thing for us to do, first of all, is to start out by having the Secretary of State introduce himself and his staff introduce themselves, and then we'll just come down the line. We're missing one of our anticipated committee members. Hopefully he will show up while we're going through the introductions. So, Secretary of State, if you would.
Great, thank you, Dick. So I'm Dave Scanlon, Secretary of State. Sitting next to me, many of you already know, former Senator Hennessy is now Deputy Secretary of State, Eyring Hennessy. Next to me is Anna Fay, who is our Communications Director. Next to her is Jen. And Dave Lang at the end, Chief of Staff.
I'm Ken Eyring. I'm from Windham, New Hampshire, obviously.
Merrill from Durham.
From Manchester.
Olivia
Teschner, Haverhill, Bradford County.
And we are expecting Andrew Georgevits to be joining us. When he comes, we'll allow him the opportunity of introducing himself. Our first order of business is to approve the minutes of the last meeting. Okay, next on the agenda is to be introducing into the record of written testimony received since the previous meeting. Do we have a motion? Motion and seconded. Any discussion? They are thin this week. These pieces of paper that we received. No discussion? I'm sorry? No? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The written testimony has been received and will be made a part of the meeting material. Okay, next we have a presentation that is going to be given by Associate Attorney General Ann Edwards for the State Attorney General's Office. Would she please take the floor? And we look forward to hearing your comments and testimony.
Thank you very much. Also with me is Miles Madison. Miles is the attorney who's in charge of the Attorney General's Election Law Unit, and so he will be joining me in this presentation today. Thank you very much for having us. We appreciate being here. I'm Ann Edwards from the Attorney General's Office. I've been involved in overseeing and working on New Hampshire's elections since at least the year 2000 and for the Attorney General's Office, and I did some matters earlier in the late 90s as well, but my real focus has been since the 2000s. Today we're going to discuss generally the types of investigations our office does, the historical and recent investigations that we've done regarding wrongful voting, issues that we're tracking like electioneering, political advertising, campaign finance, ballot counting devices, and some specific election reviews which you may have seen in the press, including Windham, Bedford, and Laconia Ward 6. Just as a background on the law, Part 1, Article 2 of the New Hampshire Constitution provides in part that all elections are to be free, and every inhabitant of the state that is 18 years of age and upwards shall have an equal right to vote in any election. To safeguard this constitutional provision, the Secretary of State oversees all elections, and under RSA 7:6-C, the Attorney General has been designated by the legislature to enforce all election laws in New Hampshire. In 2017, Attorney General Gordon MacDonald established a freestanding election law unit within our office. At that time, the unit was staffed by one full-time attorney. Not always the most robust, but it was an important unit, and that attorney was specifically assigned to dealing with election law matters. In addition to that one attorney, we had a full-time election law criminal investigator. And so those two people were the main core of the election law unit. Now, in 2022, the election law unit has two full-time attorneys, a full-time criminal investigator, and an investigative paralegal. It also has me as somebody who helps when we need an extra body involved. The election law unit is responsible for investigating, enforcing, helping with training, and prosecuting violations of the state's election laws. Specifically, the ones that we focus on are with respect to the elections themselves on election day, lobbying issues, as well as campaign finance. These changes that the Attorney General has made to the election law unit over the last 5 years have really made a difference in being able to focus on doing the investigations and the reviews that need to happen. With respect to the biennial reports, the Attorney General has different biennial reports that we issue every 6 months to the legislature. And those biennial reports are broken out into 3 different sections. One section shows the category of complaints that we've received in that 6-month period and the number of them and which month they've been received. The second section lists all the complaints that were received in prior periods and had remained open. And the final section lists all of the complaints that have closed during the 6-month period of the report. And we attach to the biannual reports the letters that we send to different individuals, either letters to the people who filed a complaint or letters to the individual involved in the complaint, oftentimes both of those people. Any settlement agreements we reach, any cease and desist orders that we issue, or any other official communications that describe how each complaint was solved. And over the past 2 years, our office has received complaints that have led to the opening of 133 election law investigations over that 2-year period. 36 of those were related to alleged wrongful voting. 53 were related to alleged illegal campaign activity. 9 were related to alleged election official misconduct. 6 were related to alleged campaign finance violations. And 29 are related to general election reviews. In addition to those formal investigations and reviews, our office has received thousands of inquiries over the last 2 years via our hotline. We have a 1-800 line that is really the lifeblood during elections on election days, because we hear from voters who are having challenges at the polls or who have seen things that they're uncomfortable with at the polls. But the hotline is open all the time, and so we receive calls on it on a relatively regular basis. It's also one of the ways election officials will stay in touch with us. And some of the inquiries that come in through the hotline are also the ones that turned into the investigations that I listed just previously. Every day, we work with members of the public and election officials to be a resource on election matters in New Hampshire. Under the investigations, part of our mission is prosecuting election crimes. Our investigations and our reviews confirm that there is no systematic wrongful voting in New Hampshire, but there is wrongful voting. It does happen, and when we find it, we prosecute those individuals who vote who aren't entitled to do so. There are a set of affidavits that individuals can use in New Hampshire if they go to a polling place and don't have evidence or proof, which is something as simple as a document like an electrical bill that can show where you live. If an individual shows up at a poll and doesn't have any of those, then there are 3 different affidavits that can be signed depending on different things. One is a challenge voter affidavit. That's if somebody challenges an individual voter claiming that they don't have a right to vote somewhere. The moderator has that individual complete a challenge voter affidavit, and that the moderator makes a determination as to whether or not that voter can vote. There's a qualified voter affidavit. That includes for individuals who don't have proof of their age or their citizenship. They can sign a qualified voter affidavit and be allowed to vote by signing that affidavit. The third one is a domicile affidavit. The domicile affidavit can be filed if an individual doesn't have proof of where they live. And with those different affidavits, the Secretary of State's office gathers the information from all of the local election officials as to which of those affidavits might have been used by an individual. I won't go through the way each one of them gets reviewed, but the Secretary of State's office has a process for reviewing all three types of those affidavits. And there are thousands of them that are used in every election. What happens at the end of the Secretary of State's review is that if they're not able to confirm that an individual either lived at an address during the election or was 18 years of age or was a U.S. citizen, then that information comes to our office. And hundreds of these are referred to us after each of the elections. And when we then use regular law enforcement techniques, we look for people's licenses, we look for car registrations, we search databases that we have of individuals' addresses. We will actually send our criminal investigators out with a list of people's names, and they'll go and knock on doors. And if the individual doesn't live at a house where they claimed they did, they'll knock on neighbors' doors to see if they can confirm that way. We are able to confirm the vast majority of those individuals. There's a small number each time that we are not able to resolve. It doesn't mean that those individuals weren't casting lawful votes at the time. It just means that we don't have sufficient information to form a conclusion about their domicile or their qualifications. And lots of times that's because people move. So sometimes you'll see this issue with college students, because by the time we get the information on these affidavits, it's 6 to 9 months after the election. It also happens with people who are members of the military, because they could be deployed somewhere else and not in that area. It happens with people who are here in New Hampshire for short-time jobs and might be here for a 1-year position and then don't stay after that time period, so they too move. And also in the last few years, what we've seen is the house sale boom. And as people have moved, as they've sold the house, it takes time, it takes time to track those people down. If we can track them down through the Registry of Deeds and confirm that they were living at that address at the time, we accept that information, but we can't always tell where they're moving to in the next iteration. We will check with the post office to see if we can get forwarding addresses. There are ways for us to get the information, but it's difficult in this mobile society to be able to track down everyone. So as a result, there are often a small number of them that we are not able to track down. And when I say small number, I mean small number. Out of thousands of them each election, there are times where we're down to 2 affidavits, or we're down to 16 affidavits. We can really get the vast majority of them by using all the different investigative techniques. So I'm going to give you a history of, and I'll promise not to make it too long, but I'm hoping you'll find it interesting. In 2018, we did a presentation to the Ballot Law Commission that went back at that time for 20 years as to what election fraud or voter suppression complaints the Attorney General's office had received and when the Secretary of State's office had also received, and that we've been able to deal with during that time period. And it's a challenge to go back beyond that, as if we all go back into the 1990s, there weren't a lot of computer databases for managing documents and things like that. So As the Secretary of State can tell you, the Vital Records Department is full and full and full of boxes of state records in the Archives Division. So we went back and pulled as much information as we have. We're not sure if this is all of them, but this will show you that on average in each election cycle since 1998, there has been at least one case with an end result that had a finding such as wrongful voting, sometimes a conviction or a civil penalty or an admission of wrongdoing, and we issued either a cease and desist order or we prosecuted the individual. So in 1998, there was a criminal conviction where a voter pled guilty to knowingly signing a voter registration card representing that his permanent address was in Plymouth, New Hampshire, when he was in fact registered and lived in Tilton, New Hampshire. He voted in the November 3rd, 1998 election in both Tilton and Plymouth. And in the end, he was fined $800. In 2000, there were at least 3 incidences of UNH students who contacted the Durham election officials requesting to be removed from the voter rolls in Durham because they stated they improperly registered to vote in Durham. They didn't consider Durham to be their primary domicile and wanted to remain domiciled in another jurisdiction. In 2002, there were cases that were prosecuted by the United States Attorney for the District of New Hampshire with information that our office provided and the New Hampshire Democratic Party provided. These resulted in criminal convictions. This involved the conspiracy that was related to the Republican National Committee phone jamming the Democratic Party's phone lines and interfering with the get out the vote effort of the Democratic Party. There were some individuals served 7 months in prison for those convictions. There were others who pled guilty to arranging for a telemarketing business to do the hang-up calls that resulted in the phone jamming. That individual received a 3-month prison sentence. There was another individual who was involved in telephone harassment regarding that phone jamming scandal. That individual was sentenced to 10 months in prison, but that conviction was reversed on appeal. In 2004, we had a criminal conviction for an individual who provided a false address when registering to vote in Dover. There was a fine of $500 that was suspended for 2 years of good behavior. There was also a civil penalty for voting in Dover by a voter when that individual was domiciled in Rochester. Again, there was a civil penalty of $500 that was waived for community service. In 2004, we also had a criminal conviction by the Londonderry Police Department. And the Londonderry Police Department found a 17-year-old who thought it would be a good idea to use his dad's name to obtain a ballot and vote in the 2004 presidential primary. That individual received 8 hours of community service. There was another criminal conviction in Nashua in 2004 where a Nashua man signed 2 nominating papers for a candidate for president prior to the election, and the second name that he signed was actually a family member's name, because you're only allowed to sign 1 petition. We also had a civil penalty of community service for a Manchester resident who voted in Meredith when actually domiciled in Manchester. The individual there was a victim of domestic violence and was confused regarding how to be able to vote and protect her address information. And I'll just take a moment to let everyone know that our office does maintain a voter confidentiality role for individuals who are victims of domestic violence, and they can register and vote through a confidential means. And that is one of the focuses of the Secretary of State's training every 2 years when they go out and do those trainings, because it's important to protect those individuals and be able to let them vote. In 2006, we had an individual who we received information from the state of California that he had voted under what turned out to be a false name. The name he voted under in New Hampshire was Clark Rockefeller. His real name was Christian Gerhersreiter. Ultimately, the state of California, however, took care of him because he was prosecuted for and convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and assault and battery with a deadly weapon in California. So we didn't prosecute him. In 2006, we also had a civil penalty for $2,500 because an individual double voted in 2008, 2000, and 2006 in the general elections in Hampton and Salem. He owned residential property in both towns, but he was domiciled in Hampton. And I'll also add here as an aside, we often find individuals who have properties in 2 different communities in New Hampshire who think that it's okay to vote in 2 different communities. And they'll often tell us things when we chat with them, like, well, I only voted on the town elections because, I only voted one place on the state elections, but it doesn't matter. You only get one place to vote, and that's where you get to vote. So we do spend time educating individuals on that. 2008, we have more criminal convictions. One voter who voted twice in the same election for the office of president. That individual pled guilty and received a 12-month suspended prison sentence and 2 hours of community service. Cease and desist from a voter regarding a residence and domicile in Derry, but thought it would be easier, actually the domicile was in Londonderry, but felt it was easier to vote in Derry, so he voted in Derry. That individual received a cease and desist. There was also a cease and desist from an individual who voted under his father's name in Exeter, while his domicile was actually in Portsmouth. And there was a civil penalty of $2,500 in 2016 when an individual, that's a repeat. In 2010, there was a civil penalty of $2,000 suspended for 2 years based on confusion that was caused by election officials. It was in a municipal election, and this was where an individual applied for a ballot in Hudson after voting in Litchfield. And the confusion was his first ballot was cast in Litchfield, even though he wasn't a Litchfield resident. This sometimes happens in communities, particularly along the borders of the towns, and sometimes in the city on the wards, where it's not always caught that an individual has registered to vote in the wrong ward or in the wrong town until some part of the process. And so usually what happens is they're very sensitive to that now in the wards where they have individuals where they, lots of times what happens, if I give you an example in Manchester, there are times where the middle of the ward line goes right down the middle of the street. So this side might be Ward 1 and this side is Ward 2. And when that happens, it can cause confusion with people as to which ward they belong. The election officials in those wards are very good at it, but occasionally something goes wrong, as it did in that example that I just raised. And so in that case, we work with the election officials to correct it, but we don't punish the voter for a mistake in that case. In 2012, there was a criminal conviction for a $5,000 fine and a suspended prison sentence, plus the loss of the right to vote in New Hampshire, even if he does move here, by a gentleman from Carver, Massachusetts, who at one time did live in New Hampshire, but hadn't for a long time. He lived in Massachusetts, but he registered and voted 3 times in Manchester, twice in 2012 for the presidential primary and the general election, and also in 2008 for the general election. There was a civil penalty for a voter who voted absentee in Milford, and then on election day registered and voted in Keene. That was a $1,000 penalty. There was also a $250 penalty to a mother who forged an absentee ballot application for her son. In 2014, we had a criminal conviction for a $1,000 fine plus 12 months prison sentence that was suspended. This individual also lost his right to vote in New Hampshire. He knowingly made a false statement regarding his qualifications to vote, and he registered to vote in Salem and in Windham while he was domiciled in Manchester. We indicted for individual for voter suppression and attempted voter suppression for attempting to induce voters to refrain from voting in a May 19th, 2015 special election in Rockingham District 32. We have a civil penalty of $250 at Windham for an individual who, again, applied for an absentee voter for her son and forged his signature. In 2016, we have a $2,500 civil penalty for an individual who also double voted. And then I'm going to turn it over to Miles so that he can go through the matters that we've had in the last 2.5 years.
Good afternoon, members of the Special Committee, Secretary of State Scanlon. My name is Miles Madison. I am charged with running the election law unit at the Attorney General's office. Associate Attorney General Edwards mentioned, I'm going to cover some of the more recent prosecutions and cases that we've had, some of the issues that we've been tracking that have been more frequently complained about and responded to by our office, and then also some of the election reviews that we've conducted recently. I would note that a lot of our prior actions, in that description you just heard, span the range from criminal convictions to cease and desist letters to other notice letters or warnings or just corrective actions in order to try to correct a voter's mistake. We do have multiple tools in the toolbox in terms of what is an appropriate way to proceed on different investigations. With the assignment of a full-time attorney in the election law unit in 2017, a full-time investigator, and then additional staff since then, the unit's ability to investigate and proceed on cases has expanded accordingly. So there are a number of different actions. As we mentioned, those are contained in our biennial reports. They contain all of those closure actions, other enforcement actions. Just wanted to hit the criminal convictions and other charges that we have more recently pursued, and this would be after the establishment of that full-time position in the Attorney General's office. We would also note that a number of complaints, information that come to our office comes via different sources. So we have the hotline where anybody can call and talk to a member of the unit about an election unit or about an election issue. Sometimes it can be questions, sometimes it can be a complaint, sometimes it can be a concern. We can't give legal advice or recommendations to those members of the public, but we can point them to statutes, to guidance information, to other resources to answer questions, and can work through some of those issues with them. But we do receive complaints via that channel as well. Sometimes they can be from citizens who see someone in a polling place that they don't think is qualified to be there. Sometimes it can be from election officials who are looking at paperwork and trying to resolve an issue. Sometimes we have investigations that begin from programs like the cross-check program. It's a program that a number of states across the country participated in, essentially sharing the voters who voted in different elections to be able to compare to see if the same individuals voted in different states. A number of prosecutions over the past few years have come from that program, where we match names, investigate that. The number of names that we received from that program was over-inclusive. Like with the affidavits, we had to sort down and try to identify what were the true violations of law, and then we proceeded and we have prosecuted a number of individuals who did vote in multiple states. In terms of that investigation and when complaints come to us, sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes it is on election day. We receive a complaint and we're able to follow up with it immediately or start an investigation. Sometimes it's through the review of paperwork much after an election. For misdemeanor offenses, we have 1 year statute of limitations. For felony offenses such as double voting or wrongful voting, it's a felony statute of limitations of 6 years. So we are conscious of the time of analyzing and investigating complaints to be able to proceed accordingly. So going over some of our more recent prosecutions, we have a 2019 guilty plea and sentencing for an individual for wrongful voting. He registered and lied on his registration forms. He was not domiciled in New Hampshire. Also in 2019, a couple who voted in more than one state. They were voting both at a property that they owned in New Hampshire, and then they also voted regularly in Massachusetts. Also in 2019, an individual who voted twice or was convicted of voting in New Hampshire and in Florida. In 2020, individual who voted in more than one state, again for New Hampshire and Massachusetts. In 2020, we had an arrest for an individual who voted by going into a polling place from Georgia and then cast a vote when he was not domiciled. He was simply passing through New Hampshire. In 2020, we had a conviction, 3 counts of wrongful voting for voting in the March 2018 town elections. So instead of 2 different states, it was voting in different towns in New Hampshire. We had a 2020 indictment, a case that is currently pending for a felony jury trial, an individual who is not domiciled in New Hampshire and cast a ballot in New Hampshire by absentee. 2021, individual who voted twice in the city of Lebanon. 2021 as well, another individual who voted in New Hampshire and Michigan, convicted of a felony wrongful voting offense. 2021 relating to the 2020 presidential primary, an individual who both lied on registration paperwork and then wrongfully voted in the presidential primary. In 2022, we had 3 different individuals who pled guilty to voting in more than one state. It'd be New Hampshire and Arizona, New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and then New Hampshire and Massachusetts as well. And then more recently, we have a pending case relating to a claim of domicile and voting in a town election where that individual was not domiciled in that location. We have a number of open investigations as well. Those would be tallied in terms of the number in our biennial reports. So in addition to those criminal proceedings and criminal investigations, there are a number of other issues that we proceed with on the educational front and then the civil enforcement front in the elections code. The first I'd like to talk about would be electioneering by public officials. This is something that we hear a lot about. We have lots of complaints about it, and then have also been working to clarify for the public and for public employees the analysis and the way in which the law should be read. The 2 issues relating to electioneering by public employees concern who is subject to the prohibition and then also the use of government property in electioneering. The law in New Hampshire prohibits public employees from electioneering, which would be advocating express advocacy for or against a candidate or a ballot measure. Except some classes of individuals, some classes of public employees are allowed to electioneer, such as elected officials, such as the heads of agencies that are appointed by a legislative or executive body, and other individuals who are privy to confidential information and therefore considered to be part of management of an executive agency. So that has created some confusion and frankly violations of that electioneering prohibition. There have been a number of different cases where individuals who have been electioneering are entitled to do so because they are an elected official or because they are a head of an agency, but we receive complaints about that as well. So part of our recent enforcement letters and public letters have been trying to clarify and lay out that framework for informing not only public officials but also the public on what is required. And it's really looking at that test of are they an elected official, are they the head of an agency, or otherwise involved in the management of an agency. If so, then they are more than likely allowed to electioneer. However, another part of that has been the use of government resources in electioneering. So even if an individual is permitted to electioneer, even if a public employee is permitted to electioneer under the law, that doesn't mean that they're allowed to use public resources to do so. One of the most prominent places that we've seen this is in the use of social media, official channels of social media for that electioneering speech. So even if the head of an agency is allowed to electioneer, that agency head is not able to use, not permitted under the law to use that agency's resources, that agency's channels of communication to do that election. So whether it's Facebook, whether it is Instagram or Twitter, other means of pushing out that message, we've been trying to clarify and bring enforcement actions in force in the form of cease and desist letters, where it's appropriate to clarify that individuals are not allowed to use resources for electioneering purposes. Another thing that we see a lot, receive a lot of complaints at, and certainly ramping up as we get closer to our primary election day, relates to political advertising. So that would be signs and publications. We have strong history and culture of political advertising signs in New Hampshire, and we get a lot of questions and also engage with a lot of candidates and political committees relating to what's required on those signs. What's most commonly missed in terms of complaints would be the identifying information on the sign. The sign, support this ballot measure, support this candidate, and no designation of who is responsible for that. So that's something that we see very often, and also in publications. If there are political ads that are placed in different newspapers or other sources, not having that paid for information, not clarifying who is responsible for that advertisement, and then also not making clear that certain ads are actually political advertisements. Something that's required under the law so that the publisher is obligated to say this is a political advertisement, include a banner as such so that readers know that it is political material and not some other sort of ad. We have received some inquiries and complaints related to ballot counting devices, both the activity and maintenance logs and the completion of those logs, and then also we have answered questions related to the statutory authority for the use of ballot counting devices, which we found in RSA 65640. One of the missions that we engage in, consistent with efforts of the Secretary of State's office, would be education of election officials and election volunteers to ensure that the requirements of the law are met. So some of the complaints that we've received have been the activity logs of ballot counting devices not receiving the correct number of signatures. They require 3 signatures, there may only be 2 on the activity logs. So following up with towns, investigating as appropriate to make sure that the paperwork documenting the handling of ballot counting devices is complete, is filled out correctly, and creating that transparency of how our election officials handle ballot counting devices. Moving to election reviews, if we receive a complaint or information that there has been some issue with an election, either relating to counting, to reconciliation, to ballots being not counted, to voters not being able to vote at polling places, we will investigate. A number of those reviews have turned into more lengthy analyses to try to determine if there were flaws in the administration of an election or if there were flaws in the counting of ballots. 3 of those reviews that we have dealt with over the past year or year and a half have been relating to Windham, to Bradford, and then also most recently the Laconia Ward 6. I'll turn it over to Associate Edwards to discuss Windham, and I'll discuss the other 2.
If I could just make a couple of comments on Miles' excellent presentation, just so people know, especially on signs, when signs don't have the correct information, we use a good old-fashioned New Hampshire way of solving that. We call the candidates up, tell them to get a Sharpie, and go out and write on all of the signs. So that's usually the solution to that. Stickers or Sharpies will solve that problem. Additionally, with respect to the ballot counting devices, towns and cities have a right to choose if they want to use a ballot counting device. The voters in towns and cities have a right to choose if they don't want to use it. And so what happened in the last few years is that we've had some communities who had petitioned warrant articles to try to have their community no longer use a ballot counting device. That's the right way to go about that, if that's a choice that that community wants to make. And so when people call and ask us how they could stop using a ballot counting device in their town, we provide them with the information for going ahead and doing that, and it's up to the voters in that community to make a decision on that. The one final comment is on Crosscheck. I'm glad Miles mentioned it. Crosscheck is a program that doesn't exist currently. Between the states that were involved in it, I believe there were 27 total states who were part of Crosscheck. We will say that the electronic voter database, which is ElectionNet in New Hampshire, is very helpful in being able to follow information for an individual voter, particularly if the voter moves within New Hampshire, you can see it, but even if the voter moves out of state, we often use that as one of our investigative techniques. So moving into the Windham audit, the Windham had some challenges with their 10,006 ballots in the 2020 general election, and there were concerns about the different counts that came out. As a result, there was a forensic audit that the legislature asked our offices to hold, and that was held with the Secretary of State's office and our office choosing 3 different auditors. And those individuals established a process for how they were going to audit those ballots. And if anybody has seen the Windham report, you can see that the process was pretty detailed in the way they did it. They double-checked each of the 4 Windham voting machines that were used during that election. They did it by running the ballots through them. They ran test ballots through them. They took the machines apart and studied them. And so it was a significant audit that resulted in the report that ultimately found that the problem with the difference between the recount that the Secretary of State's office did and the count on the night of the 2020 election that was mostly done by the machines had to do with the fact that the absentee ballots had been improperly folded. And the fold lines had, the ballots, when they're absentee ballots, have little marks on them called scores that show where the ballot is supposed to be folded. Those fold lines don't ever go through an oval beside someone's name. What happened in Windham was COVID hit. There were a lot of officials in their town hall who were ill. They had to get a historic number of absentee ballots out to individuals because individuals didn't want to come to the polls at that time to vote in person. And the result was they used a folding machine that they had in town hall and that they used for other mailings, and it wasn't calibrated in the correct places. And so many of the ballots folded over in an oval. And what happened as a result is it caused a shading in the oval that the machine read as an overcount. And so those ballots weren't individually counted because it looked like the voters voted for too many candidates in certain races. And so when the hand count happened at the Secretary of State's office, then those votes were correctly counted. So since then, the advice and the recommendations have been from the Ballot Law Commission as well as the Secretary of State's office to make sure that ballots are correctly folded. We had election officials as well who volunteered to help with that audit. That audit ran for 14 days or 15 days. And almost every single day we had election officials from around the state who took this seriously enough that they wanted to volunteer and be part of this and work through it. Those individuals brought that information back to their communities and back to trainings, and the Secretary of State has used that information too. So we don't think that there are any communities who don't understand that they need to make sure they fold these ballots correctly, but we're trying to make sure that message gets out even more so. There was also some sort of basic challenges, which were the absentee ballots. They were not necessarily processed correctly or in the best manner that they could have been. There ballot counting devices weren't necessarily fully tested according to the Ballot Law Commission's guidelines or directives pre-election, and that at the end of the election, the ballot storage boxes weren't adequately sealed and they didn't have the signatures they required. So as a result of all of those issues, our office sent a letter to the town of Windham telling them that it's a significant concern that we have, and as Miles will explain in a few minutes, that's earned them an election monitor who will be at their election for the primary election in September.
We have two other reviews that have also resulted in the appointment of election monitors. The next being the town of Bedford. This originally came to the Attorney General's office attention approximately 2 weeks after the November 2020 election, when Bedford officials discovered that they had failed to count 190 absentee ballots. What occurred was in the pre-processing of ballots, absentee ballots, which Bedford received a historic amount in the 2020 general election, were alphabetized and then put into tray tops and boxes in an orderly fashion to be transported to the polling place. On election day, those boxes were brought to the polls, were set out, and the absentee ballots were placed in the tops of those boxes. Roughly 180 to 200 ballots in each box top, still in alphabetical order, to be brought from that processing area to a ballot counting device to be counted on election day. An election volunteer almost certainly carried one of those box tops, and instead of putting it on the table of ballots to be counted, put it on the table of ballots that had already been counted. So the ballots in those 190 envelopes were not taken up and were not counted on election day. When the deputy clerk was conducting a full reconciliation after the election, she was unable to reconcile the numbers because she identified that they were off by 190. After working through those numbers and trying to figure out what had occurred, she realized that that number of 190 was approximately the number that was in a box top. So she and other election officials the next day went to town hall into the vault, unlocked the vault, found the boxes, the sealed boxes of absentee ballots, and in one of those boxes they found, still alphabetized, 188 absentee ballots that were not counted. And they called the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State's office immediately called us, and that's what initiated our investigation. So we spoke with and interviewed all of the election officials involved. We looked at the reconciliation paperwork, other documents. As part of that investigation, we sought a court order to have a public session to go and reopen boxes associated with that 2020 election to try to find additional paperwork associated with reconciliation efforts for the election, as well as to be able to search through the absentee ballot envelopes to determine if there were any other ballots that had not been counted or not been found. We also sought to verify that the names on the ballots that had not been counted were accurate. That was compiled by Bedford officials. So we had a public session at the State Archives in coordinating with the Secretary of State's office to go through, and we sorted through approximately 7,800 absentee ballot envelopes. We found 2 additional absentee ballots that had not been counted, that hadn't been removed from their envelopes, which brought the total from the 188 ballots that Bedford officials had found to the 190 that the deputy clerk had identified as missing. So at that point, the numbers did reconcile in terms of the number of ballots that were not cataloged and counted on election day. So part of that public session was not to count votes, it was to count ballots and inventory ballots to make sure that the process and our investigation, we were able to explain how this occurred. I'm not able to identify at the precise point in time or individual that moved that box top, but it's clear that it was inadvertent error from an election volunteer that carried that box top and put it in the wrong place. Part of our response and effort in an election review is to not only identify what our investigation was, what we found, but then also corrective actions and to learn from the process. Not only in the particular town or particular instance, but then also to take that knowledge and that flaw or shortcoming and then incorporate it into trainings and education for other election officials. But as a result of that error, the Attorney General made a finding that there were significant deficiencies in the vote counting in Bedford, and as a result of that, the Secretary of State appointed an election monitor.
And just before Miles moves off that, there was one other issue in Bedford, which was when were these 188 ballots located, at what time? Because within 7 days of the election in 2020, the Secretary of State's office collected what was supposed to be all of the Bedford ballots in order to do a recount. And these ballots did not come to the Secretary of State's office, and it wasn't determined by Bedford that they had a problem until November 16th, at which point the Secretary of State's recount had already been in process. So as one of the things Miles mentioned, one of the problems was that during a recount, all of that voting documents, everything, the empty envelopes, the ballots, everything is supposed to come to the Secretary of State for the recount, and it was clear that that didn't happen in the case of Bedford.
And following on that, one of the recommendations or findings of our election review for Bedford relates to that reconciliation of how long it took to identify the missing ballots or the uncounted ballots. Even though on the day in Bedford, election officials had a whiteboard keeping track of the number of voters who had voted and the ballot inventory, they didn't compare that number against the absentee ballots received or absentee ballots counted and the number of voters checked in as having voted at the end of the day. One of our findings was that a preliminary reconciliation going through the checklist for the day and doing a count of how many people voted according to the official checklist, looking at the vote tallies, looking at the ballot inventory, the number of ballots cast, that will give, those numbers should be equivalent on election day. And that gives a very good indication that the number of ballots that were handed to voters, either absentee ballots or on election day, the number of ballots cast and votes align, and that there isn't a batch of ballots that have been missed. There wasn't a preliminary reconciliation in Bedford at that point. There was the more in-depth reconciliation that took place as names were scanned in from the checklist into ElectionNet, and as the clerk's office went through the documentation in the week and a half after the election. That took too long to identify that those ballots were missing. So that's something that, as an outcome of this, we've been emphasizing is a preliminary reconciliation, having a good sense of what are all of the ballots and are all of these different numbers, these different sources of information that allow election officials to reconcile. Are they in alignment on election day when you can identify and potentially fix some of these issues? We had another election review, Laconia Ward 6, that also involved ballots not being counted. It was a subsequent election. Essentially what occurred was the election officials in Ward 6 in Laconia put ballots into a compartment in the ballot counting device, a side compartment, also sometimes called an emergency compartment. So they were cast by voters on election days in 2020, and those ballots were never removed or counted. They were piling up. There were 179 ballots that were left in that side compartment of a ballot device that were at a subsequent election found by other ward officials when that ballot counting or that ballot collection box went to that ward. election officials on election day morning were doing a search of that box. They opened all the compartments, and one of the compartments was full of ballots. That started our investigation, which was looking at how that number of ballots ended up in that side compartment, and then why they weren't counted. There are a number of reasons why ballots can be put into that side compartment. Ordinarily, in the ballot counting device and ballot collection box, you feed a ballot in, and it's counted, and it goes into the main collection box. Those ballots are counted and cast in that moment. A write-in ballot with a ballot counting device records that a write-in vote was cast on a ballot, goes into a diverter compartment so that those write-in votes can be hand counted. Election officials take those ballots, go through, and then mark what the write-in votes are. A third compartment would be that side compartment where if the ballot counting device will only accept ballots, if it's jammed, if for some reason it's not working, voters can cast their ballots. They can be secured in the ballot collection device, and then they can be removed later to either be hand counted by election officials or fed back through the ballot counting device to be counted electronically. So we don't have any indication that the ballots that ended up in that side compartment, that there was anything wrong with those ballots, that there was any conduct or error that led to the ballots being there. Simply the fact that the moderator and the election officials responsible for doing the ballot collection box inspections didn't know that they had to empty that compartment out after the elections. And so in both the primary in 2020 and then in the general election, 179 ballots cast, collected in that side compartment, not counted. Similar to Bedford, our office sought a court order to have a public session the same day, the next day, subsequent day, to go through and inventory those ballots that were found in the side compartment. We were not, again, counting votes. It was to tally the number of ballots and which election they were cast in. So that tally and that investigation also led to another finding when we were trying to do our reconciliation of election results. As with Bedford, election officials should have been able to note on election day that the number of ballots cast, the number of voters that were checked in, and the vote tallies were not equivalent because there were, between two elections, 179 ballots that were cast but not counted. That should have raised red flags for election officials. In working through that reconciliation paperwork, or trying to reconcile the results, our investigation revealed that there was double counting of ballots that ended up in the diverter compartment. It's essentially driven by the moderator and one other election official with whom he worked, not understanding the basic operations of the ballot counting device, and then the basic obligation of how to count write-in ballots. Essentially what happened is a ballot that had a write-in vote or a ballot with blank votes would go into the ballot counting device. So it would properly be diverted into that compartment in the ballot collection box. And then what should happen is those ballots are collected by election officials, and then the write-in votes alone are hand counted. All other votes on that ballot have already been counted by the ballot collection or the ballot counting device. What happened in Coney Ward 6 is the moderator believed that every single vote on each of those ballots in the diverter compartment had to be counted. What that meant is that the write-in votes were properly counted, and then every other vote on the ballot that the moderator or other election official handled was counted twice. Once by the ballot counting device and then once by the election officials. So it was dozens of ballots. We're not sure the exact number of ballots that were in the diverter, but somewhere between 38 and 54 ballots that resulted in hundreds of double counted votes because there were 15 races that were listed on each of those ballots.
I'm confused. I'm sure you said it right in here. I thought you said they were in the compartment when they were counted for subsequent election.
So there are two different errors that happen on election day. if we're talking about the 2020 general election, that day there were both errors that I was discussing occurred. So one was ballots were put into the side compartment and not counted. Those were discovered in 2021. That led to cast ballots not being counted. There was also double counting of ballots that went into the diverter compartment.
Excuse me, that's what I mean.
Yes. So both of those errors were happening. Votes were not being counted, and then other ballots were getting counted twice, which the numbers still don't reconcile, but the number of ballots that were not counted in the 2020 election from the side compartment is somewhere in the vicinity of the number of ballots that were double counted. So even though it's not possible for election officials to reconcile their numbers on election night, the magnitude of those two errors wasn't reflected in those reconciliations because they partially offset. So one of our findings and our conclusions from the 20 Ward 6 review is that the moderator did not understand his obligations under the law, did not attend trainings or invest time in understanding how to adequately run an election. The administration of the election, his understanding of how to administer an election was severely lacking. As the result of that finding, the Attorney General directed him to resign, and he did resign. Also, in that recent finding, the Attorney General made another finding that there were significant deficiencies in the conduct of the election, and based on that finding, the Secretary of State appointed an election monitor. Very briefly on election monitors, the election monitor is someone who is knowledgeable in the area of election law and is tasked with observing elections, engaging with election officials. It would be for the subsequent elections. So in this case, all three monitors will be monitoring the elections in Windham, Bedford, and Laconia for the state primary on September 13th, and providing both oversight and education. So ensuring that the elections are run according to law, and then also issuing a report within 30 days, both addressing the original issues that led to the appointment of an election monitor and any other issues that the election monitor observed. So it's an opportunity to make sure that the same things aren't happening again, as well as understanding that the elections or any other issues haven't impacted a fair and transparent election and the administration of elections in those three different locations.
Would you like to explain how our office deals with complaints when we receive those?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are multiple sources where we can receive complaints. Someone can call in, email, mail in different complaints. We have the hotline. We have a complaint form to help people provide us information to be able to promptly act on complaints. What happens is a member of the election law unit will review that complaint as soon as it comes in and try to determine what are the appropriate next steps. Sometimes we receive a complaint that is not a violation on its face, not a violation of law or not a violation of election law. Sometimes there are complaints that relate to other areas of the law, and we can make a referral to the correct entity to take a look at that complaint. If there's an election law complaint that appears to be founded, we will start investigating. So we have not only Chief Investigator Richard Tracy, who's a former member of the election law unit, but potentially other investigators in the Attorney General's office who may be assigned to investigations, whether it is a domicile complaint, other wrongful voting complaints, political advertising complaints, to conduct those investigations. And it can proceed in any number of ways. Sometimes it can be reaching out to the subject of the complaint and interviewing them, requesting information, requesting material if it's a political advertising issue. Sometimes it's a lengthier analysis, such as if we have a domicile complaint. Someone sees someone in town hall voting on election day and doesn't believe that they're domiciled in that town. We will investigate to determine where that person has a driver's license, registers their cars, owns property. So our investigations can unfold in a number of different ways, but we review them initially as soon as they're received to try to catalog them and respond quickly. If it's a political advertising, for example, telling someone to go put a sticker on their sign to remediate. If it's a first-time offense, if people are making the same error multiple times, then we'll escalate our enforcement actions. We're trying to respond dynamically to ensure that we have fair elections. So that is one of the interests that we are very conscious of, is trying to not only collect information, but to understand and make sure that that our elections are being run transparently and according to the law.
And it's really important for people to know that we do take these complaints very seriously, and we let people know that we've heard their complaint. So many times the complaints come in by email, sometimes they come in writing or by phone. We talk to people immediately. Usually within 24 hours, but definitely within a week, people know that we have received their complaint. And we will tell you that we oftentimes will hear, particularly if somebody is being investigated by us, that they complained to us in the year 2021 and never heard from us. One of the great things about having an investigative paralegal connected to us is that she manages all of our data and has an incredible database full of information. And so we will look as to whether or not that individual filed a complaint with us in 2021. And often when we go back to that individual and say, we're very concerned, we don't have that complaint, we would like to deal with that complaint, please give us the information, they'll often say to us, well, I didn't really complain because I didn't think you'd do anything about it. So it's very important to us. We are cataloging all of that information and making sure that we respond quickly. So please, if you hear individuals telling you that we aren't responding and we're the great black hole, we've been called things like the Office of the Eternal Journey and other things like that, please tell them to get back in touch with us, because we do want to look into whatever the concern is that they raised. We also are aware of a couple of other issues that have come before the committee. One of them had to do with the 2020 election in Camden. We have polled our poll inspector checklists during the general election in particular. I think in 2020 we covered 98% of the state with visits from poll inspectors assigned through the Attorney General's office. We don't have anything on our checklist showing any major concern there. We don't have hotline calls of any major concern in Camden, so we're not sure what the concern is, but if somebody would like to raise it with us, we'd be happy to look at it, particularly as we come up on the state primary. We want to make sure that we don't have any concerns, and we will have an inspector. We'll make sure they stop in at Camden to see how things are going. We've heard that you have heard some concern about the Exeter School District elections in the last municipal elections. There were some challenges, not only in Exeter, but in a few other towns that had to do with filing for office. The towns do things slightly differently in how they have individuals file, and some towns, part of it is whether somebody's signing up for a 1-year term, a 2-year term, or a 3-year term, and whether that's actually included on the filing form itself, which is what we have now told the towns it needs to be, or whether it's included on a separate document that's a sheet of paper that the town clerk is managing, showing who's signing up for which race. And sometimes that caused confusion in Exeter as to whether somebody was running in one of the 3-year elections or the 1-year election. And so that, we did investigate that, we did deal with that. In the end, different individuals thought they were running in one race versus the race they were running in. And that will not happen again in Exeter, and it shouldn't happen in the other 2 communities we dealt with either, because those filings need to be clear, so that on the face of the filing document, it should say what office the person's running for, who the person is, and what the term of that office is. And so we believe that we've solved that problem, but we always wait until the next election to see if we really have. One of the things about the Windham audit is, and we saw this in Bedford as well, at the end of the Windham audit, or near the end of it, one of the concerns that was raised was that in many communities, there was one machine in the community during the 2020 election, which had an unusually high number of votes for, at that time, candidate Joe Biden. And we contacted every one of those communities that was identified for us and a few other ones, and confirmed that what happened in those communities is that in those cases, they had chosen one machine to primarily be the machine that all of the absentee ballots were run through. And the absentee ballots tended towards more votes for Joseph Biden than Donald Trump at that time. It didn't appear to be that there was any problem other than the fact that those were the machines that were the absentee ballot machines. There have also been some concerns raised about people voting from homes that they don't live in. As I explained earlier this afternoon, that can happen because people move. It's a very mobile community that we're in right now. We also have people who are allowed, and this is one of the more confusing areas, we have people who don't live in New Hampshire any longer. Some of them live overseas, but New Hampshire was their last domicile. They're allowed to vote. They're allowed to continue to have a place to vote. Many of them only vote in federal elections, but some of them still vote in town elections. And so as a result, those individuals use the last address that they had in their community here in New Hampshire as their voting address. As long as they haven't established a new domicile anywhere else, they are allowed to do that. Finally, the one thing that we can't say enough about is our election officials in New Hampshire. We have the most amazing group of dedicated volunteers, which is essentially what they are, who run our elections in New Hampshire. During the time period of COVID, as the rules were changing week to week, they worked closely with the Secretary of State's office and with the commission that was in place at that time to try to come up with reasonable rules that would keep our election officials safe as well as our voters safe. They were flexible, they were fluid, and they were efficient. They ran excellent elections in 2020, as they always have. And they continue to do that. They, as I said, during the Windham audit, on some days we needed as many as 25 election officials to come and work with us to run that audit. They came. They worked with us for hours on end. They came on a Saturday and worked. They took it seriously, and it mattered to them to understand what had happened in the Windham vote so that there was such a discrepancy, and they wanted to make sure it didn't happen in their community. The Secretary of State puts on unbelievably detailed trainings for these individuals, and as with this commission, the Secretary of State moves those trainings all over the state. They happen in person, they happen by Zoom, they happen by recording. They're available to people in every manner so that people can be trained on the election laws in New Hampshire. The Secretary of State's office and our office jointly put out the election procedure manual, which sadly is growing every time we go. I think it started at about 75 pages and might be up to 275 pages. But we make sure that it's comprehensive and has all of the information so the election officials know what they need to know in order to run a good, solid, transparent, efficient election. We have significant confidence in our elections in New Hampshire. Our elections are transparent, our operation is transparent, our election officials are transparent. We make sure that elections are run consistent with the state's legal obligations, as well as any of our federal obligations, like UOCAVA, which is the Uniform Overseas Voter Act. And we make sure that once we complete our investigations, we provide all public information that we are allowed to provide, so that people know what has happened in the investigations that we have held and what and if there needs to be any correction. And we think it's very important to have that information out there.
So thank you for inviting us to present to you today to describe how the election law unit operates, what we do, what issues we see, and what outcomes we arrive at. As Anne mentioned, sometimes it seems as if we're not speaking about some issues or some investigations. We have the same obligations as a law enforcement agency to not comment, and we don't want to be commenting, providing, making public information if we're in the middle of an investigation. But the unit is structured by statute to be making public what happens, which is what our elections are. Our elections are public meetings, and the outcomes of the Attorney General's investigations into elections are public. We release our closure letters. We release our cease and desist letters. Prosecutions are public. That is, those are all mechanisms that deliver oversight and transparency to our elections. That, combined with the education and information that our office seeks to provide both to the public and to election officials in conjunction with the Secretary of State's office, that provides a framework that supports our election officials, that supports our elections. So we hope that that overview of accountability and transparency provided by the Attorney General's office gives you some context into how it operates and provides confidence in our elections.
Let me first say to Anne and Miles, thank you very much for taking the time to come up and make this presentation. You gave us over 36 examples of various violations and activities that have caused concern in the public, and I think you gave a very detailed response to how your office addresses those, and so I thank you for that. I think the challenge is that we still have a significant number of people in the public who aren't satisfied. And I certainly have a number of questions that I would like to ask, but I'm going to let the committee have at it first to see if there are any questions that they have, so that we can hopefully come away from this meeting with a better understanding of not what the problems were, but what the solutions are. And so let me open it. I'll start with Andy here to my right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for being here today. I would add it's great to see you both. I have a quick question or clarification needed here, I guess, with regard to your follow-up on complaints. And that is just that you mentioned that every complaint is acknowledged. In the case of those that you deem not in need of follow-up, do you also let them know that that is your decision, as well as just acknowledging the fact that you got their
Yes.
complaint?
Yep. So our routine practice, the response can vary a little bit depending on how it comes in. So, for example, it could be a hotline complaint where someone calls about a sign not having information or thinking that there is an issue with political advertising. If in that discussion we can determine that this is compliant with election law, then we may describe that, point the complainant to the RSA and discuss the law with them and say this doesn't appear to be a violation. We won't take further action on this. If you have additional concerns or you find, now that we've discussed this, that there are signs or there are other issues that do violate the law, please report those back to us. So sometimes the conclusion can be in the form of a phone call. Sometimes it is an email. It's responding back and saying, here are the provisions in the law that answer your question or that define this as not a violation or not enforceable. Sometimes it is after an investigation. If we have discovered that it's unfounded, we will write a closure letter to the complainant explaining why. So that will be citing the law, our analysis, and our investigation. If it is for example, a cease and desist letter where we are ordering someone to stop engaging in a particular action, we will copy the complainant on that so that the complainant is aware of the official action that our office has taken. So our ordinary protocol is for every complaint that comes in, there is an acknowledgement and then also a response at some point in the investigation, depending on when most appropriate, to let the complainant know what has occurred with that. Have received additional complaints about updates. I sent you this complaint, I gave you this complaint, and I haven't heard anything. We always encourage individuals to reach out if they're seeking an update. It is our routine practice whenever there is a conclusion to an investigation and we can show public information to include the complainant on that so they know how the complaint ended up. That's something that we do manage.
Let me go to Doug Teschner and then.
Yeah, I want to echo appreciation for you being here, taking time from hiking. I was up on Moose Lot with my 6-year-old grandson. Say for the record, Miles is a married daughter of one of my old climbing buddies from the last conversation over the line. I appreciate what you said again at the end about election officials and the quality of election officials. And I think it's really incumbent on us as a committee to really reinforce our support for election officials. Yet at the same time, sometimes they mess up. And my town, Haverhill, is undergoing some pretty difficult issues that I know you're aware of. I represented the legislature, it's now represented by Rick Black. And I've always had confidence in your office, but you recently issued a cease and desist order against a supervisory checklist in my community, which has really undermined my confidence in your ability to do proper investigations, particularly where I think someone was really unfairly criticized. And earlier in this commission, I was at a point where we need to put more resources into the AG. At this point, I'm thinking maybe we need to separate the budget office or something different because it's really shaking me, I have to say that. Thank you.
Again, thank you for taking the time to come today. You mentioned electioneering, and as someone who's a campaigner, campaigning is what I love to do. Having the right verbiage on signs, where to put signs. One of my goals coming out of this commission is to educate moderators as to on election day, polling locations, where signs can go and where people can stand. Most moderators know the 75-foot rule and signs can be mostly in the public right-of-way. Whereas I've addressed in Concord moderators that want to put you in the back 40 and the signs that are in front of the building on the public right-of-way are taken down. And you go to that moderator and say, excuse me, sir, thank you for volunteering per se, and why are the signs out? Oh, you threw them out, they weren't supposed to be there. Well, throwing signs out is first off against the law in here in New Hampshire. But how do we get to a point where we can educate these moderators? Because there's other moderators, you can stand right next to the door of the polling location. You can have your signs in the polling location. There is no standard rule depending on which part. Again, Concord, not as Republican leaning as I'd like it to be. Those moderators seem to be very not willing to compromise on certain issues. And when you go to them and say, hey, can we do X, Y, and Z, you're just told no. And this is my polling location, I can tell you what to do. Now again, we do give full authority to the moderators on election day, but that's where the city clerk, that's where your office can come in. Do you feel you can provide more people on election day to educate moderators as to the actual rule of law? And then do you feel it would be wise of this commission to come up with a standard protocols for electioneering to help with different moderators?
So if we could answer those questions separately. One, let us, first of all, the cities sometimes have more challenges in managing their polling places than the towns do. And the only reason for that is they only have elections every 2 years. They're not doing elections every year. The town officials just seem to be a little more knowledgeable about how to manage. The other thing about polling places is they're all different. The buildings are all different. We have a rule, and it's the rule that's in the election procedure manual. There are already rules in the election procedure manual about how to set up an electioneering zone. There needs to be a 10-foot wide corridor into the building in which nobody comes into that corridor to electioneering. They need to be beside that. So the challenge with having a one standard fits all, it might mean that that won't fit depending on what that polling place looks like. For example, we have polling places where the road for the polling place goes right beside the small little sidewalk into the building, and there's no grass space between the building and the sidewalk. You can't have an electioneering zone there safely. So that electioneering zone has to be in a different location. But all of that said, you can't put somebody into the back 40. And we do know we have communities where that happens. And when that happens, we send our inspectors out to those polling places and we work with those individuals. So if you want to provide us with some ward numbers in Concord, we'd be happy to go look. That's an easy place for us to check on the state primary. We'll make sure we have people out there, but we will definitely do that.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Does a city's statute overrule a state statute, like for signs, for example? I'm dealing with a lot of candidates right now that are putting signs in the public right-of-way, and the city is taking them down, whereas you're saying it's against a city ordinance, but it's not against a state ordinance.
So it all depends on where the signs are and whether or not, if they're on city property, the city has a right to have the signs removed. Those signs aren't supposed to be destroyed as you have identified. They're supposed to be held. They usually are. It's usually the Department of Public Works who removes those signs. They usually hold them in whatever shed or building is closest to that, and the candidates can go and pick those signs up. So it depends where the signs are. If they're actually on city property, they aren't supposed to be there. Even on election day, they aren't supposed to be at the front. If you're using a school, they're not supposed to be on the school property, the signs. They can be across the street. They can be down the street on either side of the school property, but they can't be on the school property.
Andy?
Thank you. You mentioned that cross-check doesn't exist anymore, that you think you've had pretty good results with using ElectionNet. Is that the name?
Yes.
And I wondered if you had particular thoughts about Eyring, this system that has been brought up a number of times to the committee as a more thorough way of cross-checking, I guess.
I don't have specific observations on it. I am not conversant with it, but have heard of it as well. There have been various efforts to try to share information across states relating to voters, who is voting and where. That was the demise of cross-check was because of disputes about the preservation of information, the security of voter information, and then just the burden, the administrative burden of sorting through tens of thousands of names that are identified as potential double voters, and then trying to sort that down by initial, by birth date, and things of that sort. So I know that there are and have been various efforts to try to coordinate or share voter information. I don't have specific comments or thoughts to share at this point on there.
But am I right in remembering you said that ElectionNet has been particularly useful when it comes to lists that are within New Hampshire, so cross-checking within the state?
Yes. So that's correct. So ElectionNet would be the New Hampshire database that captures information about New Hampshire voters and flags and enables election officials to understand where someone is registered, or flags an issue if they're trying to vote in two different locations or being reported as voting in two different locations. So
you don't cover Massachusetts.
ElectionNet does not cover Massachusetts.
A lot of examples you gave today were Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman.
Border issues.
I'm sorry, are you finished?
Done. Thank you.
Yeah. Just for the benefit of the committee, I want to just make a comment about Eyring because it's been brought up a lot. And nobody has actually addressed what is Eyring. And I would suggest that the committee get the information about Eyring so that you can see for yourself what is involved, because it is a lot more than just a checklist comparison between the states. part of the requirements is that the DMV of the state that participates has to share on a regular basis all of the DMV records for that state. And then in addition to that, the program requires the state to identify not just voters, but potential voters. And there's an additional requirement in there that there be a regular contact with those individuals. So it's a voter registration promotion tool as well. New Hampshire is not a voter-voter state, unlike almost every other state in the country. And so we don't have that link up that all of the other states do between our voter registration base, our voter registration database, and the DMV records. So in addition to the fee for joining, Eric, the annual fee for participating in the program, there could be a significant cost in making our own in-state databases match up for the purpose of sharing that information. And that's assuming DMV would be willing to do that. But there's a lot more to the ERIC program than just sharing voter registration data.
Thank you. Eric? Yeah.
Thank you. When you started your testimony today, Assistant Attorney General Edwards, you had mentioned that there's 133 election law investigations that you've covered. Can you provide the committee with those? I tried to keep up with you, but I wanted to listen instead of taking the time to write everything down. So if you could provide us with that list, that would be terrific.
Okay, I'd be happy to do that.
I got a couple more things. You touched upon the ballot counting device activity logs, which are also the chain of custody. One of the things, and you mentioned that they're not completely filled out, and that you're instructing people to do that, and I appreciate that because it's disturbing when I've looked at quite a few logs and there's not the correct number of signatures on the logs. Sometimes the reason or the purpose is not defined. Sometimes, many times in Windham, the serial number for the security tags were not listed. So there's a lot of small things that mean a lot, because if you're going to have security measures in place, they should be followed. If you want and expect confidence from the people who live in your community, then those, and they're very simple, basic guidelines. So I appreciate that you're doing that. One of the things that I would like to hear your comment on is that whenever LHS, who's the vendor that services all the machines in New Hampshire, whenever they come in, I would say a vast majority of the time, 90+%, I'm just going off the top of my head, they just list maintenance. And maintenance doesn't really tell me or anybody else what they did to the machine. And it's my understanding by the law that once machines have been modified, that they're supposed to go through a recertification process. They're supposed to be tested and recertified. To my knowledge, I don't know that that is ever done. So I would appreciate it if you look into that as well. Either confirm or deny, confirm or correct, what I just said. I'd appreciate it if you could get back to the committee and let us know if I just made an accurate statement, and if it is accurate, if you could make that part of your training with all of the moderators across the state, because that's important as well. We want to make sure, from my perspective, I want to make sure that the machines are working right. And in Windham, it wasn't just the folds. They found that there was dust, they weren't properly maintained. The scanners, it was a mechanical problem. The optical scanners didn't work properly. They didn't read the ballots, and once they took some air and just blew it in there, they still weren't 100% accurate, but they vastly improved. And they said that they weren't going to take the machines apart in order to do the proper maintenance, but that's part of the process. And I think that all of that should be listed on machines. It would also be helpful to maybe modify the machines. So in addition to just signatures, you have to print their name, because if you look at the vast majority of the signatures, whether it be LHS or our town officials, sometimes it's impossible to know who signed it, and therefore there's really no accountability if you don't know who who did the work or who witnessed the work. So I think that's an important piece as well. That's something that I'll recommend that the committee put in the final report. And then one last thing, you had mentioned that it's the right of the towns and the cities, they have a right to choose whether or not they can choose to use voting machines. And I agree with that, the way that I've read the law as well. But there seems to be some confusion in towns. In some towns, I got a call from someone I don't know who lives, I believe it was Sandown. They're trying to have a special election so that the people can decide and vote. And the selectmen have taken a position, it's their decision. Now, from my conversations with former Secretary of State Gardner, that decision can be made either by the Board of Selectmen or it can be made by a vote, a popular vote of the people. And the Board of Selectmen cannot override the vote of the people if that election takes place. So the selectmen are saying that they don't have to hold a special election because there's money involved and there's a cost. And I don't have the case off the top of my head, but I know that I had an attorney look into this last year, and there is precedence that says the cost of a special election is not justification for a Board of Selectmen or a governing body to that they can't hold a special election. I do know that I think there's a clause in there that says it can't be held within 60 days, the general election, so maybe that would have come into play. But if I can have someone, if I can refer someone to your office to look into that so they can get clarification as to whether they're selectmen or handling that process or not, I would appreciate it if you would look into that.
So we would be happy to look into that. The individuals from Sandown want to reach out to us. Nobody has reached out to us. We don't give legal advice to members of the public. It's not what the Attorney General is authorized to do, but we certainly would look into the concern. The other thing that we always tell individuals is if we don't have at the Attorney General's office general oversight over any of the towns or cities in New Hampshire. I think the towns and cities are happy to hear that, but it makes it challenging when there are issues that happen that could be clarified because we don't have the ability to direct them to do things. So we certainly would look into it and have and review it. What ends up happening in those situations and what we tell individuals is they might have to bring an action in the Superior Court to ask the town to be ordered by a judge to have a special election. That's one of the ways that can occur. So if somebody wants to call it that, we're happy to do that. The thoughts about having people print names under the signatures, I will agree with you. I can't read most of the names of individuals who sign those, so often people can identify who it is because they know. One of the challenges with the logs is the logs are supposed to be signed by 3 people. So it's one person's signature and 2 other witnesses. What often happens is we only get 2 signatures on the logs. The Secretary of State's office this summer, or actually I guess in the late spring, hired an individual who used to be an investigator in our office, Paul Broder, to go out and to look in communities and check on these because we have seen that it's a problem. And as Mr. Eyring has pointed out, it is the chain of custody, it is the information that has us identify who's had access to the machine during that time period. So, and I would agree that the Windham audit found that the machines, one in particular, had quite a bit of dust in it, and there were discussions, as we had with the Ballot Law Commission, about how the maintenance could be done. The Windham audit findings are found in the report, and those are the findings. The main issue, though, with the ballots counting, as far as we are concerned, had to do with the folds and the issue with the folds. So we are happy to look into any of those items. Thank you.
Sure.
You mentioned that, there's one thing I really appreciate clarification on. There seems to be a line where your office takes action and at other times it doesn't. So where is that line? Because if for instance, you've taken action, the AG told the Laconia moderator to resign for serious deficiencies. So that's an action. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't It wasn't just something that you investigated and then let drop. Yet, you know, your position is that you don't give advice that a legal action might need to be taken through the courts. Where is that line drawn? Because if the Board of Selectmen are mandated by the law, the way that I read the law and the way that Secretary Garner communicated to me last year, that it is a mandate with the special election petition that they have to hold a special election, that the will of the people has to be followed, and it's not advisory. The sense that I'm getting from the AG's office is that you'll look into it, but it's just advisory. They're breaking the law. If they're breaking the law, why don't you pursue that like you did when the ballots were double counted and the ballots were not counted, and you found that there were egregious errors, and that led to your actions?
So that's an excellent question. It's an excellent way to frame it. The reason I said we'll look into Sandown is I don't know that the law requires that a special election be held. I don't know. I know there are specific timings around special elections. There are also a specific number of voters who have to request the special election. And I don't know the facts around the Sandown situation. So we need to see that. That needs to come to our office and we'll look at it. And when we do think election officials are not following the law, that's not providing legal advice, that's enforcing the election law. So what we do, the line is we will enforce the election law. So I guess I'm sort of hedging a little around Sandown because I don't know what the facts are.
That's fair. So I will ask them to follow up with you, and if they follow all the rules, and I believe they have, according to what I've heard, have the petitions filed with the correct number of signatures. It's really just the selectmen saying, no, we're not going to do this. It's our prerogative to hold the special election in the House. So I appreciate that you'll look into that. The last thing I want to say is that I've heard the justification for the one anomaly machine in Windham to have a vast number of Democrat votes as applying that to the fact that that machine was primarily used for absentee ballots. Mm-hmm. And if you go back and you look at the voter rolls for that day, there are markings on there that indicate how many who voted absentee, so you can total up on the actual voter rolls for the same day elections, what parties they were. And the percentages of Democrats do not overwhelmingly exceed the percentages of Republicans. And so from my perspective, I just want to respectfully disagree that that is not a reason to explain why there was an enormous swing in the vote from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. It wasn't just a presidential race, it was all the way down ballot. So I just wanted to get that on the record. I hope that makes it into the minutes as well. And I think that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. We've heard a lot of stuff in the various hearings that we've had, and a lot of them are recurring themes that we've heard. One of the recurring themes that we've heard from folks with varying degrees of certainty is that the use of mechanical ballot counting devices in New Hampshire is unconstitutional under the state constitution. Could you comment on that?
Well, the Constitution provides that the elections will be run as open meetings of the selectmen in the different communities, including the wards and the cities. And then the law from there, the legislature has determined that there is a process to allow ballot counting devices. That's a double-step process. First of all, the Ballot Law Commission has to approve the device as a device that can be used in New Hampshire. And then each community has to be able to determine whether they want to use that ballot counting device themselves. And there was a comment made, it might have been by Mr. Eyring, that sometimes that decision is made by the voters, sometimes it's made by the governing bodies. There are different ways that decision can be made. I would always take the position that the voters have the final say, and the voters can request in a petition that they would like to not use that. And if a majority vote in the community decides that, I'd be surprised if a if a managing body of that community is not going to go with its voters. But there's nothing unconstitutional about that system, and there's nothing unconstitutional about the use of the ballot counting devices, because the Constitution doesn't have specific language in it saying votes have to be cast a certain way and counted a certain way.
Thank you. In your investigations, you counted a lot of individual people who've done things they shouldn't have done, voted in 2 towns, voted in 2 states, all that kind of stuff. You ever taken it upon yourselves to figure out what percentage of the vote those instances are?
No, but we can tell you it's minuscule. I mean, we have, the Secretary of State may be able to provide us with the last total count of voters in 2020. How many people voted? It was
over 800,000.
Yeah, it was over 800,000, and we investigated 15 of those.
Okay.
That's what we investigated.
Thank you. We've had assertions before this committee that there ought to be a different kind of ballot prepared with individual identification for each ballot, because that would keep ballot stuffing or counterfeiting of ballots from happening. Have we ever, to your knowledge, had instances that you had to investigate with either ballot box stuffing or counterfeit ballots in there?
No, we haven't had, no. I mean, there are different ways. There's sometimes confusion when people look at votes. So for example, UOCAVA voters can vote on ballots that are sent to them by email. And so they don't look like official ballots necessarily. It doesn't make them unofficial ballots, but that causes confusion with people if they see those ballots. There are also, we too have met with different groups who have different ways of how to do ballots. In New Hampshire, we haven't seen a situation where there have been counterfeit ballots or that we've had absentee ballots that don't come back with all of the correct paperwork. New Hampshire has a significant process for being able to vote absentee, and the paperwork that goes, you have to ask the city or town clerk for the absentee ballot, so that paperwork stays with your ballot when it comes back, as well as all of the affidavits and information you have to sign with it. So there would be a lot of documentation that somebody would have to copy in order to have unofficial ballots come through. The other challenge is if you're in a community with a ballot counting device, they function on certain weight paper. So they won't count ballots that aren't of that type of paper, which would result in an election official then having to field the ballot to determine whether a hand count should happen. And the ballot, I would expect that a counterfeit ballot will feel different than an official ballot. I might be wrong, but I would expect that it would. And so as a result, there's another double check there.
Miles, you got any comment?
In terms of our investigations, I don't think that we have seen evidence of the ballot stuffing or the other issues that you identified in New Hampshire.
The reason I asked the question is it would be a significant undertaking to change the kind of ballot that we use in New Hampshire for the Secretary of State. That's hard enough for that office to do it now. So I just wanted to get your comments on that. You talked about training. You talked about how, excuse me.
Just as a brief response to that, we touched on earlier the dual process for validating results and confirming the outcomes of elections, one being with the election day results and then also with the recount. Those are different procedures in many cases where it could be a ballot counting device counting the vast majority of ballots on election day. There are recount procedures where certain parties can request a recount. That goes to the Secretary of State. There's a different process there, a hand count of ballots using well-tested procedures for conducting that recount to validate the outcome. So I think that there are, built into New Hampshire law and practice, there are checks and balances that provide that confidence in the outcome of elections by having multiple methods of being able to confirm the result.
Thank you. Yeah, I seem to recall some things about that. You talked about training and how good the training is. We've heard a lot of discussion and had a lot of discussions among ourselves about whether training should be even more formalized. It's made available to the town and city officials. We know a lot of them are elected officials, so we have to be careful. But there have been suggestions that training be mandatory. There have been suggestions that training, if training is missed, that there be some kind of penalties. We've heard that at least one, maybe two cities, if people don't go to training, they don't get paid for their duties. And we've had even suggestions that either election officials have to be certified or they could be removed if they don't do training. What are your thoughts on more intensive policing of training or enforcement of training?
So I think that a lot of those things that you just mentioned would require legislative action in order to occur. I also would be concerned about elected officials. Elected officials have their own autonomy in doing certain things, and so you'd have to be cautious on something like removing them from their responsibilities. There are many election officials who are volunteers and who are not elected, and we know of many communities where they provide either their own training or they provide access to the Secretary of State's training. And if individuals don't go to that training and they're volunteers, those communities won't allow those individuals to be election officials at an election until they go to training. That, I think, is something that's easily done by the communities. I think it's harder when you get into elected officials. Those trainings are important. There's a lot of information that individuals need to know. And as Miles was just explaining, not understanding how to reconcile the numbers causes problems with people missing, their votes not being counted, as well as it also is a protection with respect to things like ballot stuffing or counterfeit ballots, because individuals are taught on how to make sure they're following the checks and balances. So training is important, but we don't have an official position on the requirement of training with respect to elected officials.
No, I didn't want to suggest that any of those things could be done without legislation, but one of the things this committee might do is say to the legislature, we need laws on this or that. So, at your excellent presentation to the ballot election 2 years ago, you addressed the question of the reports of busloads of people coming over the border to border towns to vote, and what your findings have been. Can you tell us about that?
I can, and the answer to that question, one of the questions there was whether there were buses with out-of-state license plates that brought voters into polls, and the answer was yes. There were buses with out-of-state license plates that brought voters into New Hampshire polls. They only had New Hampshire voters on them, but at that time, a couple of different get-out-the-vote organizations hired buses from Maine, Massachusetts, and Vermont, depending on which side of the state you were on, to pick up voters at different locations and bring them to polling places, and then to bring them back to their homes or to a central drop-off area. And we did confirm that as soon as we heard about it on election day. We sent investigators out to those polls. We spoke with the bus drivers. We figured out which groups had hired the buses, and we confirmed that that was the situation. During different elections, we get calls like this. Sometimes Salem is a good example. For whatever reason, the folks from Massachusetts like to come to the Salem polling place and help campaign for people. And so you'll often see Massachusetts cars in the Salem polling place. We send an investigator down, and they've talked with many people from Massachusetts who are very passionate about elections and have told us that the New Hampshire elections are much more fun than the Massachusetts elections, so they come out and they hold signs for people. They're not voting, but they're out there, and it's probably a little disconcerting if you pull in and there's 15 Massachusetts license plates sitting in your parking lot. So we take it seriously and we check them out. But we have never found a situation where individuals who are not qualified to vote in New Hampshire have been bussed into New Hampshire and have voted in New Hampshire.
And finally, we've all heard about the complexity of our laws and regulations and processes. And we've all seen the election manual and gotten a copy of the statutes. Do you think it would be helpful for this committee to suggest to the legislature that there be a comprehensive review of election laws to try to make them a little more systemic.
Well, our office over the years has suggested that election laws, it would be helpful if election laws were reviewed, because there are several election laws that have now been ruled unconstitutional by the court but are still on our statute books. So we would be happy to help participate in that if the legislature were interested in doing something like that.
Okay?
Yes.
You spoke about Windham, Bedford, and Laconia, Ward 6. Were any of the numbers close enough to change any of the election results? And do you review all of the reconciliation reports to see if it's just sort of those 3 towns, or if there's a problem in any other any of the 309 other polling locations?
So with regard to Windham and Bedford, one of our earliest determinations is to try to determine if anything would be outcome determinative. Generally, the way that we look at that in the first instance would be whether the number of ballots involved is larger than the margin of victory. So without counting votes, whether it's even mathematically possible for the outcome to change. And that's no in those circumstances. In Laconia, we're unable to make a determination on that front because we are, from the documentation of ballots, unable to determine the exact number of ballots that were double counted, even though we are able to determine the exact number of ballots that were not counted, came from the side compartment. So Laconia would be an outlier, and that we are not able to make a determination as to whether the outcome determined. And that's just by nature of the number of ballots that are involved.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add to that, because you asked a more broader question about do they look for anomalies? The Secretary of State's office does that through the Ballot office. We look at all of the returns that get sent back, and when we see on the reconciliation papers that there are numbers that aren't matching up, we try to get to the bottom of that by contacting the town and asking them to double check their figures. And we don't always catch everything, but we catch a lot.
First, I'm sorry, Andy, and then
I guess I'm going to sound like the devil's advocate, maybe, or just a little bit off. With Adam, since this position of the election, your position, finding cases and hearing out, you have found 133 discrepancies, I'll call them discrepancies, you guys had to go investigate. Do you feel like there was more people in your unit? They find the thousands of complaints that have come in. Do you think there'd be more cases?
So that 133 would be different investigations that have been created as a matter. So some of it may be just internal language that we use. We can receive a complaint. If that is a complaint that is justified and requiring investigation, that we have to investigate in order to make a determination about the complaint, then we open a matter, just essentially creating an investigative file for that complaint. So when we're talking about those numbers, that's the number of investigations that we have, where we are investigating to determine an outcome relating to a complaint, which can be unfounded, it can lead to a criminal prosecution. I think that the additional resources that the unit has received in recent years has allowed additional focus on those complaints. So I think that the depth of investigation, the promptness of response have improved. I think looking at that, you look at the number of criminal prosecutions, so convictions or pleas for essentially wrongful voting, the number hasn't meaningfully changed in terms of the scope of the issue. So I think that it is still the case that it would be one-off instances of wrongful voting rather than seeing an increase or an indication that it is merely a resource limitation that is leaving a number of wrongful voting occurrences uncounted.
And the reason I bring it up is last in Nashville, we had a gentleman who had brought affidavits, copies, again, take this like a grain of salt, gentlemen that brought affidavits, signed affidavits he moved from Windham to Hampton. People that were on, previously the homeowners of Hampton, there was on the voter rolls, there was multiple people out of that address. He and his wife were the only individuals that lived there. He went to the polls. The other 3 individuals had signed affidavits that they still lived there in the town of Hampton, which they did not. Again, those were submitted to the record. An investigation like that, is that something that's going to be ongoing, or does your office know? Again, I can tell you a lot, but again, brought the affidavit signed by 3 individuals that no longer lived in that household in Hampton. So obviously they're breaking the law by signing the affidavit saying that they live there and they don't. And the gentleman exposing it, what type of action could we expect to see for those 3 individuals that faked an affidavit?
So I'll speak to that circumstance of an affidavit or information relating to domicile. Anna mentioned earlier that we have investigations where there are circumstances where someone is registered and still legally registered at an address and can remain registered at that address even if they're no longer living there, such as if they have moved and have not established another domicile. So that is an investigation and analysis that our office conducts regularly. We'd be looking at exactly those circumstances and seeing, okay, well, on the face of it, these documents are concerning. And we have to look beyond that in order to understand, well, what are all the circumstances that can lead to that reality in paperwork still being perfectly legal. And when we find that there is a violation or someone is making a domicile claim that is fraudulent, we prosecute.
So I could have someone legally residing at my house, although they don't have a bedroom in my...
Sure. That could be the person who lived in your house before you purchased it, who's now deployed with the United States military and is deployed overseas and has not established a new domicile anywhere in the United States. That member of our military armed forces would be able to declare your home, oddly enough, as his or her residence, because that was the last residence they had in the United States.
So a quick follow-up on that is, do you feel it could be legal to require a domicile? Seeing that, the way I spin that is saying, for example, Concord, we have the Homeless Resource Center. So if you are truly homeless and have nowhere to go, you can use the church as an address to get your mail, register your car, you have an address to register your car. Would there be anything against the law that you know of at the top of having a requirement for a domicile?
Well, there is a requirement for a domicile. That's what the Constitution requires. You have to be domiciled in New Hampshire. The definition of what your domicile is and how it exists over time is a question of fact that needs to be determined, and that's why for individuals who are unhoused, those individuals can claim a bridge under 93 in Concord as their domicile. They will be allowed to vote in the ward that is part of that, and our election officials are trained to provide that. They often will also use homeless shelters or food pantries as an address, so that's where they can get their mail. So the Constitution requires a domicile. It's just a matter of figuring out the different components of domicile. And as Miles said, paperwork can look very concerning, but then when you start looking beneath it, you'll find out that, so for example, as I said, there are many people who have sold homes. If somebody sold a home in Berlin and they have not found a new place to live, so right now they're couch surfing, as we like to say, in Danbury at a relative's house, they can still claim Berlin as their domicile because they haven't established a new permanent domicile. They also could decide they don't want Berlin to be their domicile because they're now going to keep moving, and so they're living in Danbury, so they're going to claim Danbury in the house that they're living there in Danbury. It's one part of the analysis that we have to do every time we work through a question of that. So we would be happy to look at those affidavits and review them because those are some of the prosecutions that we've been very involved with in the last few years. Because if individuals are wrongfully claiming domicile in New Hampshire, then they shouldn't be voting here. But there's lots of reasons why they might not actually live at the place that they're claiming is a domicile.
Thank you.
Yeah, just building on that a little bit. We've had a number of people testify committee where they brought in very specific things like that, or was it that Brendan Town, New Hampshire Integrity, got a stack of documents, and other people, somebody had the complaints about the voting machines being too many Republicans. And one of my questions, I guess my question is, you say you have a database. I think what we need to be clear is where do people go if they have a complaint? Because we're not an investigatory body. I mean, that's really clear. We don't have the power to do that. But there needs to be some mechanism where people can feel like they can go. And I'm wondering if it should be something less legalistic as maybe the first step, like an ombudsman or something else who could make some initial review that says, you know, worthy of further evidence, not worthy of further evidence, or something a little less legalistic. Because I mean, I guess going back to my earlier complaint, I should say there was a cease and desist order. Is that the only? It's either unfounded or cease and desist. There are other options. I mean, I just think this is a bigger issue that the committee's got to grapple with. When these people, if they think there's something to be concerned about, yes, there needs to be a place where they can bring it and that somebody can somehow process it and make some kind of judgment. And everybody's not going to be happy. And there's a part of me that understands that some of these people are just trying to create controversy. They're not necessarily trying to get an answer. But I think we need to treat everybody in a fair way so that there is some kind of process. Do you have any advice for us about that?
Well, I would say that we have the process right now. People reach out to us every day. And most of them are just regular citizens calling in with a concern, calling in with a complaint. We have domicile complaints that come in from people who know someone in a community through a housing organization or something like that, and they'll call to us. We have individuals who have filed for office who may not live in the community where they're claiming a domicile, and we learn that from citizens in those communities. So I tell you that generally I don't think New Hampshire citizens are concerned about calling us. And we have easy access. They can do it by email, they can do it by phone. And so I would say that we are that place. From several of the groups, we have received information and we've reviewed it. For example, we have received a group of 50 affidavits questioning whether individuals live in certain places. We are in the process of reviewing those affidavits, following the investigative steps that we take on everything. And we're going through them. If we find any that are individuals who shouldn't be there, they will be prosecuted. I've heard that there are larger amounts of these affidavits out there. They've not come to our office. So again, I promote any of you hear about this, tell people to send them to our office because we're happy to go through that and review it.
So is it fair to say if people say they've gone to you and they haven't heard back, you would say that would be a mistake?
I would say that what we have seen in the last 20 months, 24 months at least, is that every time that has occurred, we've been able to either identify where the complaint came in and how it was handled, or that we never received it, and when we reached back out, we were told that it wasn't filed with us. So I can't say that forever. I can just say that when this has occurred in the last 24 months, we haven't found any of those. So if individuals would like to bring us complaints, we're happy to receive them and review them. And I guess one other comment I'd add to your earlier concern, it's very difficult, and the Attorney General's office takes it very seriously when we criticize any of our election officials in New Hampshire. We don't do that without a thorough investigation, without careful review of the Attorney General himself. He reviews every report that goes out of our office. He reviews every cease and desist. He reviews every prosecution memo. And so it is concerning to us when election officials don't fully comply with the law, and we do reach out, and we do have to sometimes take actions. And cease and desist and unfounded aren't the only ones. We do reviews where we will issue reports similar to what we've done in Bedford, where we didn't issue a cease and desist, but we issued a report that explained all of the mistakes that occurred there, and we've now assigned with the Secretary of State's office a monitor to those elections. So there are different steps that we'll take. Sometimes we just do education letters to individuals. But when people do things that are of serious concern, we will issue a cease and desist.
But you could make a mistake.
We most certainly could make a mistake. I don't have any doubt of that, but I can tell you that with the level of review in our office and the level of investigation, I certainly hope we aren't making mistakes.
I first want to apologize to everybody in the audience who came to testify. This has been a very enlightening, very important conversation, and I felt that we needed to give time to the AG's office to, one, explain what they're about, and two, to hear from the panel. And I think everybody has heard, and I'm going to echo in that as nicely as you put your willingness to work with anybody and everybody, there are people in the state who don't feel that that's the case. Now, I'm not going to characterize who's right and who's wrong in this, except that what we're charged to do is to find ways to increase voter confidence in our electoral system. And so I'm going to conclude our questioning of you and your presentation by asking, what is it that you see is the biggest problem or problems that you are dealing with in the election process, and how are they going to be fixed so that going forward we can direct the people with 15,000 affidavits to you, and you'll look at it and they'll feel satisfied that maybe they're all military folks voted in someone's house that's occupied by someone else. I don't know. But what do you see as being the critical thing that the AG's office can do to help rebuild voter confidence in the voting system?
So if I start and then I'll let Miles hop in. I think the answer is that there's a lot of focus right now from the general public on elections, and many people don't understand elections. Many judges in New Hampshire don't understand elections. So one of the things that we suggest that people do is go to their community and volunteer to be an election official. Go sit there, participate, go through the training, learn what the responsibility is, and do the job for a couple of elections and see how it goes. I think many people would then feel much more confident in how the elections are run in New Hampshire. And the most that the Attorney General's office can do is essentially the job that we're doing, where we issue the reports, we do the investigations that need to be done, and then we provide that information to the public so that they have that available to them. I think learning an election is very challenging. Having this domicile discussion that we just had, there are cases that talk about domicile from the 1800s forward. It's challenging to work through a domicile. It's very hard to say to you, Chairman Swett, that you could have a military person voting out of your house. That's a very awkward thing. It's challenging in New Hampshire, we allow college students who live here in the state to vote. Many states don't do that. In New Hampshire, our domicile law allows for that, and our legislature has made it clear that that should occur. So it becomes very confusing as to how, say, my child who might be going to school in Massachusetts votes absentee because he can't claim Massachusetts as his domicile, but my brother's child from Colorado can go to college here at UNH and claim Durham as a domicile. It's those differences in laws are very confusing. The best thing we can do is do our job and continue to provide that information as much as possible. Whether an ombudsman might be helpful on that is, that's another place where people can get information. People get that same information from the Secretary of State's office. No one hesitates about calling there and asking questions. And if there's any question about how to answer that, the Secretary of State, or if there's any question about how to answer a question that comes into our office, the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office talk constantly about those things to make sure we're providing the public with the best information that we can.
These are the conversations that I wish MUR had stayed to record, because the next question I have is, are you overwhelmed by the requests that are coming into your office?
No.
So that's what the whole state needs to hear, not that everybody watches MUR. But the fact of the matter is that you have the resources right now to address some of these issues. I think it will bring closure to a lot of the individuals and groups that are concerned about these things. And I'm going to recommend, as the co-chair of this committee, that we educate the state to a greater extent to utilize the resources at their disposal, that those things might enable them to be more satisfied with the way that elections are operated. I want to thank both of you for... I'm sorry, Miles, would you like to add?
Just following on some of those points that Ann made, I think that emphasizing that education and enforcement are both parts of our obligations. So that leads to different outcomes in how the Attorney General's office takes action, which can be an information letter, an education letter. It can be a warning saying this is one step, do not do it again. It can be a cease and desist saying this is a violation of the law, do not do it again. It can be criminal prosecution, and the evidence leads us to the appropriate resolution.
And Miles, it could be just a simple mistake by the clerk or the moderator who doesn't sign properly or doesn't put the paper in the right place. These are things that in this environment are eroding the trust that people have in government. And it's not intentional in many of the instances that you yourself pointed out in the cases that you described. But that's what we are up against, and we have to be doubly vigilant and careful about how we rebuild the trust that voters have in the electoral process. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will take a 5-minute break. We have people who have signed up for making comments, and we'll start with the top of the list. It's first come, first served. And the first person is Liz Tentarella.
Thank you.
And please sit by the mic so we can go ahead.
I think it's Ken Nelson.
Yeah, that's great.
And I brought my buddy too.
You are allowed that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you again. I'm Liz Cantarelli. I'm president of the Nonpartisan League of Women Voters of New Hampshire. And with me are two of my colleagues from the New Hampshire Campaign for Voting Rights. Hi, I'm Kelsey Gubel. Hi, I'm Sarah Gubel.
I'm sorry.
Kelsey Gubel.
Kelsey
Gubel.
Gubel.
And she is with America Votes.
Okay.
And Sarah Lobdell.
Sarah.
Lobdell, L-O-B-D-E-L-L. I'm on the sheet also to speak as myself later.
You are, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, as I said, for this opportunity. I came to speak to you at one of your very first meetings because I told you about a project that the New Hampshire Campaign for Voting Rights was working on. And today I'm here to give you the results of that project. So we know
Someone who
that
actually did their homework. It was a sign.
we had a busy summer along with 37 other volunteers. So we realized that one of the first places voters go to find out information about how to register, can they get an absentee ballot, what are the polling hours, and so on, is their town. They may not know, if they're new to New Hampshire, that the town clerk is the person who knows everything, but they often go and visit the town websites. So we repeated what the League of Women Voters did in 2012. That is, we did a survey of all 240 town websites in New Hampshire. Some of those small towns didn't have those websites, but we certainly went and looked for them, and then we surveyed all the towns that did have websites. We had a series of questions that our 37 volunteers answered as they looked at that. So if you turn to the fourth page of this,
you will see the beginning of our survey results. And we don't have to go through all of them now. You've got your copies. But one of the first questions was, is your website difficult to find? And for most of the towns it wasn't. For 13 it was. They couldn't find one. Or
Those people all from the same town, or?
No. We had volunteers who randomly.
No, I'm just saying, we
assigned
have 13 people all from the same town with a bad website, or were there multiple?
13 towns. This is 13
I see.
towns. The people who surveyed those towns had a difficult time finding a
Okay.
website for them.
Yes,
That's not.
we surveyed all 242 town websites.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yep. And then we had them look at it, is the town website apparently maintained and regularly updated? Some were out of date. 21 of them seemed not to be using it, and so on. Then we started looking for election information. And what we believe is that right on the home page of the town website, there should be something that says either elections or voting information. You shouldn't have to make that wild guess that every one of you could make is, let's try the town clerk's webpage.
Could I ask one thing?
Yes.
So you surveyed all 240.
Yes. Or
The first
242, right?
one you just talked about, that's 253.
We've got a typo on that, yeah. So 13 from 242 should be that second number, what it is, sorry.
Okay, and the total from the second one is, 240.
246, or 249?
247, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So-
So it is possible that we've got some typos here, or people said somewhat and then changed it to no, and we got two answers.
Okay.
So we had a volunteer who was kind of compiling all these results for us.
If you could send us a cleaned up version of this when you get a chance to, that would be.
I think we
As
could
I
do
said
that.
in the previous testimony, we live in a time when people are nitpicking every little last mistake. So if we
Right.
can alleviate that inconsistency, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Can I also add to my signal? So we did this via Google Doc, so some of these questions might have been like, not required necessarily, so there may be discrepancies in the numbers because someone didn't answer the question, someone answered in a way that couldn't break down into a very clean yes/no. So there may not be 200 and something, there may not be the same number of towns in every question as every paragraph, if that makes sense.
If you just state that at the beginning of the survey, that would be fine.
Sure.
But if there were 240 towns,
242, right?
242 towns, it seems to me there should be no more than 242.
Right.
Unless more than one person was looking at a town, I don't think that's.
Sorry, we'll also add that
Yeah,
there were people
let's
that...
not get bogged down on
Sure, no,
that.
but-
We understand that.
One point I'll add is that there were people who wanted to survey both the towns they were assigned and the town they lived in, which may be contributing to additional results.
Oh, yeah, no, we had a couple of people who did that, yeah. I think the point is that information on town websites is often either hard to find or lacking. So that if there is not something on the home page that clearly says elections or voting information, the would-be voter who's trying to figure out how to register in that town for the first time struggles. So that on page, whatever it is, 5, is maybe the most important fact here. That less than half of the towns have that kind of heading. Now, some town websites have a frequently asked questions section, or they have a search section, and so we had our volunteers try to use that, and then it improved a little bit. So you could find something about voting in 146 of the towns by using those search features. And then if we flip the page, We thought it would be important for a website to list the dates of the primary and the general election. The town websites fail to do that in many cases. About 1/3 of them have. How about the polling place? Now, in my little town, there's only one. It was listed. I've got a very good town clerk who manages the website. But in a city with wards, that's important. A voter needs to be able to look up his or her address and find out what ward that is and where the polling place is. And so that was, again, a deficiency we felt.
Yeah, I mean, these are questions that should all be blue.
Of course, of course. Our recent election results posted. And there are various ways they could be posted. It could just be a PDF with the handwritten numbers next to the candidates listed. Could be done in many ways. And, you know, almost half of the towns had something. Usually they had their town election posted that way because that was the most recent. Kelsey wanted to know whether the website contains information on becoming an election worker, and very few of them did. The next page, does the town's website have direct links to the New Hampshire Secretary of State's website? And at this point, I want to say how pleased we are with the great progress that has been made on making the Secretary of State's website much more user-friendly. You can find categories of information that were hard to find years ago. But because all that work has been on the Secretary of State's website, many towns haven't updated their website to reflect that. So outdated links, we had 47 outdated links. And that's almost worse than not having anything. 121 towns did not use links. So then we want to know what kind of information you can find if you're a would-be voter. Voter registration requirements, you'd think that would be on every single website. And you see the numbers there, 142 added. Absentee registration, what are the requirements for it? And even a smaller number had that. Very few, 26, made mention of college students voting. And the ones that did tended to be college towns, so that makes sense of what they would need to do in order to register. So on the next page, we started looking at what I get the most calls about at the League's office or via our website or email is, what are the voter ID requirements? And again, you would think that would clearly be stated, and the Secretary of State has a poster and explanations that really ought to be on every one of the town websites, or the link to it. And then who qualifies to cast an absentee ballot? A little better turnout here, 92 out of the 240 whatever did include that, but it's still a lot that didn't. And so does it offer an absentee ballot application link? Oh, thank goodness. All right, we've got some big yeses here, right? That 134 towns did offer that. Either through the Secretary of State's website for the upcoming election. Some of them have the link on there for their local elections. Both should be on there probably. And then the option of same-day voter registration, about half of the towns mention that you can register at the polls on election day. But again, many people wouldn't know that and would like that information. So on the last page, we wondered whether the town websites made clear that you could sign an affidavit for voter registration if you did not have all of that paperwork. You and I know what those laws are and that those affidavits exist, but 182 towns did not mention it. So a would-be voter
who, for whatever reason, whether reasons of moving or the economy or personal reasons, doesn't have all the photo ID, age, citizenship, and domicile documents that ideally would be presented, would have no way of knowing that an affidavit is an option. So most towns did not have that. Some had mention of it for one or the other qualifications.
So this is an Eagle Scout project, an Interact project, a Tea Club project in the high schools. Those kids could, for their town, could put these things all to the blue if they work with you and get this done. And it would relieve you of a whole lot of effort, and it would educate them on the value of participating in the voting system.
Well, thank you for saying that, Mr. Ambassador. Let's do it. We'll just turn it over to me. No, actually, what we're going to do next is to present a template to the towns, and Kelsey is doing that as part of our outreach to town clerks and town officials with suggestions for what should be on this homepage. So the first, not homepage, sorry, website. So the first 3 pages are a draft of a template. We took this to the Secretary of State's office a week and a half ago, and I have an appointment with the Attorney General's office with Mr. Miles Madison to go over it. The last thing we want to do is give out incorrect information. We're trying to keep it simple. In the League of Women Voters work, we always try to give the instructions in the simplest language that we can without distorting the facts. And that is a challenge because our laws are complicated. So we will go over this again carefully with the Attorney General's office, look at it again carefully, and then we are planning to get this out to all the towns. Whether they use it or not is up to them. But we feel that certainly it would help voters get the information they need in order to vote or to decide, can grandma vote absentee, whatever is going on. They should be able to find that either by going to their town websites or to the Secretary of State's website, or a combination of both. So this is what we've done. We think it will go a long way to building confidence in elections. If people can see the laws, the guidelines written out, that builds confidence. If they know where they go to register, that builds confidence. If they know they can sign an affidavit, that means even I, this disadvantaged voter in one way or another, can vote, and that builds confidence. So I don't know if my colleagues have things to add at this point. I went through that for you.
Go ahead.
What about, it almost seems like websites are almost passe in this day and age. What about Facebook? What about, do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't think websites are passe because that is the source of factual information. It's the official website of the town. I do think it would be a good idea if towns that have an active Facebook or Twitter or other kind of social media would say, by the way, the last date to register for the primary is August 31st or whatever it is in their town. I do that with League of Women Voters. We have our factual information on our website, and then we do use Facebook to promote things like that, to remind people of the dates of the election, the deadlines for registration, why it's important to vote. So I think a combination, Mr. Teschner, is an important thing.
Yes.
Thank you. I know under one of the questions, which I think is the one having to do with, is there a link to the Secretary of State's office or the pages? And you note how many were outdated. I wondered if there's a way to get a sense, if I look at this more carefully, of other instances where you found inaccuracies, as opposed to, yes, there was information about, you know, registration requirements or dates even. I mean, it seems as though I've been at it, I shouldn't say this in a general sense, but it's not that uncommon to find, and not just in terms of election information, but on websites to find outdated information.
We
So-
did, and in our survey, which had more questions than this reveals, we had a question to flag a town for the committee to look at if the information seemed to be inaccurate. So we didn't put it upon our 37 volunteers to be election law experts, but flag it, and then we looked at it. And the kind of inaccuracies that we found were phrases like, "You must show a New Hampshire driver's license." And there are other ways to prove ID, as we all know. So that is disturbing, because right then, someone who doesn't have a New Hampshire's driver's license feels, "I can't vote." So we did flag that. We have it in the individual results for towns. And I suspect when Kelsey talks to people, she will reveal that if there are those very factual issues.
But I think that can be very frustrating for people.
I think so, yeah. We also found references to the SB3. I don't know how I particularly forgot the name of that bill. It's put out of my mind, it's done. We found references to the SB3 domicile requirements in a couple of places, even though they are no longer law. That we won that case, so that's out. So that you're quite right, Ms. Merrill, that's an issue. Yeah.
Well, I just like to say thank you. You're one of the few groups that's actually come to us with some very concrete, positive suggestions. So, thank you.
So thank you very much for saying that. We hope that in your report, you suggest that towns improve their websites, make them offer specific information about voting, and link to the Secretary of State's
We'll set a
website.
date as to when we want it done.
Pardon?
I said we'll set a date as to when we want it
That's
done.
good. Okay, you can do that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ken.
One
Yes,
quick
sir.
question. It's easier to keep track of this for when we get to the final report. Could you send us a PDF?
Yeah.
Because, you know, I've got all of my stuff in a folder. And, you know, there's a few hard copy things, but I don't want this to fall through the cracks.
I think what we will do is clean it up a bit. So if you give us a deadline when we need to get you the cleaned up copy, including the template that we plan to send, we will get it to you by that deadline.
I would say probably the first week of September. We is our last meeting in Keene. So that will be on the 6th of September, and then we deliberate on writing the report. So by the 6th of September, that would be ideal.
We will work on that for you. We thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to present. And thank you for all the work you're doing on the committee. It's important work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brad?
I have a non-germane question. You get a huge amount of experience watching the Hampshire election, and you've been following this activity that we've been engaged in.
Yes.
And you were here taking the questions that we asked the Attorney General's office. On the question of the complexity of New Hampshire laws, or the complexity of putting together the election calendar, when you have to do things, when we have a law commission hearing tomorrow that goes to several people's misunderstanding of some of this thing. Does the league have any recommendations on the question of simplifying or clarifying or recodifying?
Every year, the league updates its How to Vote in New Hampshire brochure, two-sided brochure that we distribute in whatever ways make sense. And it's kind of complicated, and the print's getting smaller and smaller and denser each year, to the point where one longtime league member sent me something in the mail, and she said, "I found this in one of my folders, And it dated back to 1998, I think. And she said, "It was so easy to read. Can't we do something like this?" And I just said, no, I can no longer make it as simple as it was then. So every time we have a new bill in the legislature that affects voting, it seems to add a level of complexity, a level of specificity that for one reason or another somebody thinks is a good idea, but for the average voter just adds confusion. So the simpler that election law can be, probably the better it is for voters. The more they feel they can participate because they understand what is expected of them. And I think we're way beyond that point, Mr. Cook. And it's discouraging.
I agree with you. I'm thinking of the dates to do things. You have a date to change parties, you have a date to register, you have a date to file as an independent candidate, you have a date to do stuff, but you can show up at the polls and register if you haven't done it before, and it just gets kind of, if you charted it, it would make you more.
I picked up a copy of the election calendar yesterday when I snuck into the Secretary of State's training. I figure I need to know what commitment should be in order to answer questions. And yes, you're right, it's a very complicated calendar. I don't know how that can be simplified. Most people don't understand it. I will say that the Secretary of State's office has been using Facebook to post these deadlines, which is great. I repost them onto the League of Women Voters site so that you knew that May 31st was the last day to change parties. But how many people are looking at my Facebook page? Very few out of the total population of New Hampshire.
You mean you're not an influencer?
Gee, I wish I were. I have to change my wardrobe.
Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
On one more.
Certainly.
Well, election procedure manual, and I've had intimate knowledge of it, having helped to write it the last 2 cycles, not this cycle. And everything we say about it being complicated is true. The problem is so much of it is about checks and balances of one kind or another. And what I've tried to do as a consultant to the Secretary of State's office is how to make it clearer, even if it's more complicated. So we added this last time, we added a checklist, for instance. And of course, you're trying to make it clear for the election officials, the people that are implementing the election, which is a little different than trying to make it simpler for the voters. What do the voters need to know? What do the election meetings are about? And it's really, having been in there, let me tell you, having been asked to do that, it's really challenging. So I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate where our co-chair is trying to go with that. Just an observation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Our next presentation will be by Paul Robitaille from Durham.
Thank you, Ambassador Swett. First of all, I want to welcome you all to my home. And I hope all you're here enjoy yourselves. The things I'm going to say may not rest very easy. I want to say that I'm very disappointed we've come to this point in our society that we have to have a committee like this. If you look back in history, all the way back to the Greek city-states and all of that, whenever people lost faith in democracy, they went immediately into the darkness. And I believe today there are many forces, both local, state, and national, that want that very idea. To me, democracy is as sacred as the person up above, and it must need to be continued, because I don't want mankind to go back into the darkness. However, there's a number of things I want to say. I want to say I've enjoyed presentations both by the Secretary of State and the Attorney General here. They've restored a lot of my faithfulness. But there are certain things that I think we need to be a little bit aware of, and they're minor things right now. First of all, I want to bring up the issue of voter ID. When my mother lost her driver's license because she couldn't drive anymore, it took me 6 months before I could get her a non-driver's license ID that would be accepted. 6 months of traveling back and forth to the DMV and trying to arrange appointments, between doctor's appointments, to get her set up for that. 6 months it took. I was the former manager of ServiceLink, which we deal with elderly here in Corliss County, and I saw many of our clients and patients just give up, and they gave up their right to vote because of that. It was just too difficult for them to be able to get it. I've been retired for 2 years, maybe things have changed, but at that time, it was very, very difficult for them to do that. I would like to see that if anybody deserves the right to vote, all the way through, it's our elderly, and it should be simple for them. And speaking for that, I've been involved with elections here in the area since 1984. I'm a former selectman. I served 3 terms. I ran for office many times. I lost one election in Durham by 11 votes. And I lost my legislative seat vote by 28 votes. So elections can be close. But I also learned at that time is that sometimes the people prefer Coke, and sometimes they prefer Pepsi. And I think unfortunately in this day and age, there are a lot of people who do not want to believe that, hey, they wanted Pepsi instead of Coke. And I think that's the point we've come to today is with the questioning of our elections and our election process. And I think a lot of people are trying to use it for their own profit and their own personal gain. So I wish this committee the best it can do. I really think that if you can come to the point that maybe we can alleviate a lot of those fears, a lot of those conspiracy theories, and a lot of those ideas that are out there, that our elections are not fair. Because I tell you the truth, I've won and I've lost. And I've never seen any discrepancies in either other way. And I've had a number of experiences with that. In 2000, both myself and my Republican counterpart in the town of Durham, we redlined the town of Durham. And we did that for 2 reasons. Because at that time, you were not supposed to count absentee ballots until after the polls closed, which they were doing. The second time we called it problem, the second reason, is we received word that a selectman was walking around town with absentee ballots in his pocket. I received numerous reports, but I could never get, and I was on the line phone with both the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office that time. I could never get anybody that was willing to testify. And I could never find out what was going on. So it kind of never went anywhere. But that night, those days, we hand counted ballots. We were there till 3 o'clock in the morning. Pretty exhausted bunch of people. And they were pretty mad at me. So the next day I went into the office and I told them, I will support you on a petition warrant article by a voting machine. Since then, since 2000, this is 22 years later, because we use voting machines in the town of Durham, there has never been an inaccurate election count. They've always been on the way. So these people that want to go back to hand count voting, I certainly do not support that at all. First of all, there's the time involved, and inaccuracies are almost double. So I would beg that this committee recommends that they keep voting machines intact, because I think it's important. The other thing I want to talk about is our clerks, supervisors of the checklist, and the people that hold all of these elections together. Many of them are elderly. They had served for many, many years. They're tired and they're exhausted. They are doing the best they possibly can with the guidance of the moderators and the guidance of the election officials they have. I think many of them are willing to take training if that's suggested, but I think if you make it mandatory, you will lose a lot of them. And I will tell you right now, every year I get down to the town clerk's office and we beat our heads around the wall, try and find enough people to come in so that we can take care of the election. And I know that's the way it is in many, many towns all over the state. So before you do this, try to do a way to support those people. And one of the things I'd like to see is that you can recommend to the legislature some sort of legal protection for any election official. Because one of the things I'm worried about, and we've seen a little bit here and there, I can tell you what's happened to me, of bullying, of harassment, and other things. We've seen it a lot more in other states. I haven't seen it too much here, a little bit, but I am concerned enough that I think these people deserve the protection they need, the legal protection they need, to carry out the duties they volunteered for. So I'm hoping that this committee can come up with something like that. And I want to tell you that it really does work sometimes. In 2004, I was the county chairman and I was accused of busing people, the busloads of Quebecers across the border to vote for the election. They were right, I had a busload of Quebecers, but they weren't here to vote, they were volunteers. And they usually did, when we've done work with volunteers from Bradford, they usually leave the night of the election, just so there isn't any discrepancy on that. The next day, the Democratic Party sent out a number of lawyers so we could prepare for the challenges. I met with each single one. I took each one to the moderators personally in both 4 wards in Berlin and the town of Durham. We had 2 sites there. And Berlin had 4 wards. I met with the moderators, introduced them all, and said that's why we're here and this is what was going on. I also told them, here's my card, here's my phone number. If anything happens wrong, these people are in your way, causing problems, you call me immediately. The people that came to challenge us, challenged. They challenged 8 votes. There were no Quebecers from Quebec. People with Quebecers from New Hampshire, yes, but no Quebecers from Quebec. They challenged 8 votes. 6 of them were settled immediately by the moderator and staff. 1, I do not remember what happened to. And the last one we found was an absentee ballot that had been requested by a Republican woman on Woodland Street. And she told us why she requested an absentee ballot. At that time, you had to be mobile to be able to go. Her answer was, I didn't want to go and have to mix with riffraff. So that was the only discrepancy we found in there. So I think our system works. In a few times since then, when we've had to contact the Secretary of State or the Attorney General's office, I've received all the information and need and help that I've been able to get, had my questions answered immediately, and we've usually been able to put an end to the problems concurrently. And as for the question about the moderators, I've run into that problem too when it comes to being spacing and signs. And I'll tell you, in Portsmouth County, in the various towns where I've had to go and talk to moderators about that problem, not just in the Berlin Vermont, but throughout the county, most of the time after I talk to a moderator, the reasons that the signs and the people were pushed to the areas they were for safety and traffic. So, I wish you luck with this, because I think it's important work you do. Because if we lose faith in our election process, and if we lose faith in our democracy, all of mankind will follow us into the darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I will say that I've known Paul since the late 80s and have always seen him working in his community on all kinds of issues. And I think that he's an example to me. He's an example to us all. And I thank you for your public service.
Thank you all for coming to Berlin.
Yeah, I really appreciated what you said about you worrying about election workers harassment, because I'm obviously worried about that too. You said they need protection. And what kind of protection?
Legal protection. Legal protection.
Well, hold on. People do need to be held accountable if they screw up somehow. Define a little more what you think. Are you talking about protection from harassment?
I mean protection from harassment, from bullying, and from being sued by outside sources in civil lawsuits.
Thank you.
Andy, do you have a question? No? No other questions? Thank you very much for your testimony. Next,
Good luck to all of you.
thank you. We will next hear from Ted Boson.
Patience, I've just turned 70. It's a little stiff. Anyway, my name is Ted Boson. I'm a Berlin resident. I did come from Massachusetts, although not on a bus, and I changed my plates when I got here. I've been here 8 years. I am still the licensed attorney in Massachusetts, where since 1983, I did a number of things, but one of the things I did frequently was act as election law counsel for various organizations and campaigns. Started in 1983 with the Boston mayoral race, where the campaigns got together and participated in a retraining of all the election officials in Boston before the final vote. Let me just say that I have had the privilege of getting information from the Secretary of State's office since I've lived here, getting my questions answered, and more recently from the Attorney General's office, from Attorney Ann Edwards, who was extremely thorough, extremely responsive, paid attention to detail, followed up with me, made sure I had all the information I could get, and other contacts to pursue if I needed them. I've never, in my 35 years of legal practice, even had such attention from a public official, especially an attorney. So after listening to her presentation along with Attorney Madison today, I am so convinced that if you have recorded their presentation and you will put that on a website where all my social media fanatic friends, and I am an addict and I debate with them daily, could see it, so many of those interested in facts, their questions would be answered, their confidence would be restored. My confidence has never been higher than today, after listening to all that they have explained in the process of chasing down every violation that's come to their attention. I feel that I want to echo Mr. Robitaille's concerns about the attempt that I see in this country, along with apparently what he sees as well, an attempt to undermine the democratic process and cast doubt upon it. And if that happens, I agree with him. We are all on the tube, down the tubes. I mean, we are no better than our ability to vote and our confidence in it. Because it's all over if we don't have that. It really is. So the job you're doing is critical. What you glean from all of this evidence and testimony and present to us, the public, can potentially, you know, grease the skids to what I see happening or put a stop to it, at least for New Hampshire. And I hope you do the latter, because there's always going to be something that gets, falls through the cracks or isn't as thoroughly settled after even a thorough investigation. When you look at 800,000 votes and approximately 23 cases that came out of issues of potential illegalities, you're talking about less than infinitesimal of a voting quality problem in this state. I'm very impressed. As familiar as I am with Massachusetts election laws, and they love to boast about how great they are, I'll take New Hampshire's. I think the people here, and I'm one of you now, are doing an excellent job. Yes, the recommendations, some of them you've had, even here from the League of Women Voters, are wonderful. Let's improve it. Let's make things more simplified so we can educate the public without losing our checks and balances. I agree there's bullying going on. It's getting worse. I see it on social media. Election workers are getting more fearful. And if we lose even the willingness of those people to stand there and make sure that the laws are followed, the procedure is followed, then we also have a problem. That's not fraud, that's bullying, that's harassment, and that's still undermining our democracy. You can't let that happen. So I view you people as an essential component in your fact finding. You're going to have a tremendous influence on whether what I consider to be an unwarranted conspiracy to undermine democracy, whether it continues to snowball or starts to slow down and face the reality that we still have a democracy and we are doing a pretty good job at it. And I thank you for being here today. In Berlin we often feel neglected, but not today. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the people? Thank you very much, Mr. Bowman. Is there anybody here, that's the end of our list of public commentators or testifiers. Would you like to say, please introduce yourself and where you're from?
My name is Henry Noel.
Henry Noel?
Noel, yeah. I'm a retired resident of Berlin, born and brought up here. Currently running for state representative for Berlin. I attended a Zoom meeting last night that I found surprisingly interesting. It spoke on the subject of immigration, and the issue was translation services for immigrant populations who have difficulty with English and the ability to read the ballot. When I remember growing up, when Berlin was half French, half English community, there was a large segment of the population that didn't have English and that needed people to help them understand what was being presented, what was being discussed, or what the document said. I believe translation services in a community that has a large proportion of an immigrant population should be considered as a necessary service to increase the confidence of that population that the voting process is a fair and honorable way to become a citizen or participate in citizenship. That's basically all I have to say.
Thank you. Any comments? We appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
That concludes the public testimony portion of our meeting. Is there any other business to come before the committee on this afternoon? I know that we talked about read the report.
Well, the question, I guess, that's needs some discussion, and we can discuss it now, or we can get input from people by emails to the Secretary of State, to Anna, is what process we're going to use to deliberate about and to form a report when we're done after the key meeting, and whether we need more in-person meetings to do it, or whether we can circulate drafts or whatnot. My personal opinion, and obviously one input from the committee, is that we need at least one
In-person
working study, working meeting to
I would agree with
have
that.
people bring their suggestions and talk about scope and process and all that jazz.
Yeah, I would encourage that be held, everybody brings an outline of what they see as the structure, and that we accomplish agreeing on what an outline for the report might be, and to the extent that we can even give individuals on the committee responsibility for writing sections of it. I would consider that to be a worthwhile utilization of everybody's talents. And we ought to have a deadline by which we are trying to generate the report and have it published as well. So I don't know that we have to all agree on this right at this minute, but that's something that we can talk about by email and come to an agreement over the next several days. Any other business to bring before the committee?
Move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed?